Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is August the 7th, 2022, and we are here to talk about the world. Without further ado, I will jump into voice channel with my good friend Agent Smith. Hello?
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Pretty heckin' good. I had a fantastic day today.
Okay.
Yeah, I got a legendary item on my warrior, so that was just like a lucky thing. And I've been keeping steady with my burpees challenge. I did the 20 days and now I'm on day 49, so it's been pretty cool. Sticking to that. And yeah, it's been overall really a solid and strong week. I sent you something.
Fit, huh?
Oh yeah. I feel like I have basically ascended from whatever my resting level of fitness is for my diet to something that gives my body a bit of a challenge and some exercise every day. I think everyone could basically think about what your exercise floor is, which oftentimes is doing absolutely nothing, and then just say, okay, what is my bare minimum for each day? And if I raise that to say 3 push-ups in a 5-minute walk, and then you could gradually ramp it up from there. This challenge thing was enough to motivate me and get me stuck on the same thing every day and then feel good about it. So I wonder if that works for other people.
I'm sure it would.
Yeah.
It's just challenging, especially if you're not in shape.
Yes, true. Well, I had a video clip that I sent you in Discord.
I saw that. I actually saw that years ago when it was first released.
Yeah, I didn't. But apparently this is something that is back in the news again because they just bought out another bunch of local news networks. So they bought out some other media organization.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to show this to chat real quick for people who haven't seen it. John Oliver did a segment on this, but it's just really spooky. I think I can show it with sound.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about trouble and irresponsible, one-sided news stories
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. Man. Yeah, Fuzzy Cord points out their message isn't wrong, but it's delivered in the creepiest way. I think the weird thing that's a bit of a wake-up call and or mindfuck for people is that the news anchors usually aren't deciding what the main talking points for the night are. They have sometimes close to zero control, I would guess. Like, they could always go off the record or whatever, but then they would get fired. But just how much is like handed down from some other office somewhere else of, if you have a company that owns all of these local news stations, they're basically saying for every day of news, these are the main stories that you're saying, and then sometimes giving them required stuff that they have to show. It means that whoever controls those companies has a shitload of power and influence that isn't really being talked about. Fox News, I think, is one that, like, the Murdoch Group and all that, they have been talked about somewhat, but Sinclair is a company that I haven't been aware of until yesterday. But they own a lot of local news. The difference there is between national cable news, which is like the CNN, the MSNBC, the Fox News, that kind of stuff, versus the local news, which a lot of people would trust more because they feel like that's closer to home. So these are more authentic people. But if they're part of that parent organization, they're still going to have these talking points they're stuck on.
Yeah, it's different business models, right? So cable television, of course, is more national market, and then the local news channels are actually franchisees. So they'll actually make a deal with the national media company, and then, there's some influence, but by and large, they kind of do their own thing. But just because they're doing a deal with Fox or ABC or whichever national media company, doesn't mean that, the company that owns the franchise is inherently local itself. It can be itself a large company. So Sinclair is one of those. There's a couple other companies too that own franchises like that, but I think Sinclair is one of the largest, if not the largest. They just go around creating or buying up franchises so that they can kind of pool resources and make more money. I don't think they really care that much, per se, about editorializing content. Their thing is just more about the money. But as you just showed, they can if they want. And so that can be a problem in so much as there's not a lot of awareness about that. Yeah, Sinclair also was notable because it was, it is owned by a guy who supports Trump. He's kind of a Trumpy guy. So that creates some conflict of interest in so much as there's a nominal obligation to provide objective news and the desire of the owner to portray stories in a particular way that supports his political preference.
Yeah, I think most people would just generally carry the bias that the political stance that I hold is the more correct and truth-based one. So I don't necessarily think that it's always coming from a point of malice of, hey, we're going to all turn the people to the dark side. It's going to be like, in this case, the guy believes that his side of the political arena is the correct one. So he's doing his good duty in giving the American people the information they need to make the decisions that they have to. But obviously anyone who's on the other side is going to be like, man, this is biased as fuck. Yeah, it's really spooky the way that they edited that. I know that they likely have a lot of their own local stories and stuff still on the channel, so it's not just all a hive mind all the time, but when it is a hive mind, it's creepy.
Yeah, it can be impactful. I don't know that it's going to have a statistically significant impact. People kind of believe what they believe. They don't necessarily care what the local news station says. In fact, they'll give a lot of feedback when the news station doesn't say something or provides a story that doesn't align with their preconceived notions. There's one of the local channels here in Dallas actually has a segment where they'll actually read out some of the emails and letters that they get complaining about coverage. So they try to kind of illustrate that they're listening to feedback and that they care about it, although some of it is, as you might expect, a bit unhinged. Par for the course is when it comes to large markets. You're almost invariably going to get some crazies, but they let people hear about it. But that just illustrates again that, if somebody sees something like that that's meant to influence them, it isn't necessarily effective, especially if it's just really on the nose, like a blatant attempt to portray something in a particular way. That message that they portrayed there, that could be impactful because they tried to kind of present it in more of a neutral way. But the trouble there is that it's really, boring. It's not the kind of exciting content that really gets people involved in politics. It's just sort of a bland, almost public service announcement of the kind that a lot of people just sort of ignore You know, maybe somebody will hear that and think, oh, that should be something I look into, but then they're just gonna forget about it 10 minutes later. You know, one of the fundamental truths about politics is that it's hard to get people engaged.
Yeah. It
So I'm
does
not
seem like it's a greater than zero edge for whoever's controlling the media companies for like elections and stuff, just because a lot of what you control would be the favor for certain candidates of like what do we want to put them in a good light or a bad light, and a news network has a lot of sway in that because they can just do it for the whole day where they're basically saying this candidate is bad for the whole day because they favor some other candidate, and that gives them a big advantage just in the elections and stuff.
Yeah. No, yeah, you're right. It's an advantage. It does give them relatively more coverage. It gets people more familiar with the candidate and their positions. So, you know, there is some edge there, but again, I don't know how big or decisive that is in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
I'd have to look at the data to know for sure. Yeah, some countries have restrictions on how much one or the other candidate or one of many candidates, how much media attention that they're allowed to get. Well, not attention per se, but how much time on screen they get. And so they try to design that so that everybody kind of has equal time, or at least relatively equal representation in media. Yeah, places, I think Europe does that. The United States used to do that, but then they kind of opened things up. You know, we've talked before about that. It used to be that I think specifically network television and radio had to give even amounts of time to all candidates, basically, or at least both major parties. It was almost always just two. And then they opened it up in the 1980s. But it's not as though that was like the main impetus for polarization or, you know, the widening of the Overton window, as some poli-sci majors might say. It was probably inevitable just because cable television was rising in the 1980s. And the law did not apply to that. And I don't know that it could have applied to that. Network television and radio are just widely available, right? I mean, the companies literally just broadcast out into the ether, and and if you have a set, then you can pick up the signals. So there's a stronger argument there for regulation, whereas with cable, you know, you have to go out of your way to get it. So if there's a cable channel or company that's broadcasting something that is antithetical to your values and that you think is a threat to public morality, well, you can just drop your cable package. Like, you don't have to keep consuming that product. So there's an easier way there in the private sector to deal with the problem. Whereas with broadcast television or some such, you know, it's going to get broadcast regardless. So there's not as much choice, and hence there were anyway more restrictive laws. But since cable television was getting, you know, a bigger and bigger share of the market, that logic kind of fell apart. And so eventually people just dropped the whole mechanism. Whether or not they should have tried to continue to regulate it is debatable. But again, the problem there is that it's questionable whether or not the government had the legal power to actually implement such a policy, given that private sector actors engaging in, you know, private commerce can kind of have much more leeway in the American legal system than the private sector in, say, European equivalents. It's much easier for governments over there to restrict activities, you know, just because their laws and constitutions are different. But yeah, we kind of got what we got for the moment, and I don't know that there's a whole lot anybody can really do about it. And it's not as though people don't want partisan content. It's very much in demand. They seek it out. The internet is a great example of that. I mean, the internet is a wide open space. It could have been shaped into anything, but it ended up getting shaped into hyper-partisan pockets, basically, where you can choose your own adventure or choose your own reality, more like, and then just consume media from that particular pocket of the internet as you like.
Mm-hmm.
And that was all voluntary. Nobody imposed that. That's just how the market broke down.
Well, I would say that hyper-partisan content is more dank and intense because it makes usually bolder and wilder claims, which it's like the excitement level of the information is higher. It's sort of like a dry, impartial talk about something isn't necessarily going to take any severe take that's going to make waves and people are going to talk about. It's going to be pretty fair. We try to be very fair and neutral with these discussions that we have here. But if we were like going off and like bashing certain politicians and like really shit talking, probably get more clicks.
Yeah.
Because people, they like that vitriol, or at least a lot of people do. Not everyone does.
It's quite popular. You can make a lot of money doing that if you've got talent for it.
Mm-hmm.
More than a few YouTube channels to that effect. Yeah, in general, as far as fairness in the American political system, I'm not overly worried about Sinclair. There's sort of bigger problems afoot right now, to put it mildly.
What are the bigger problems?
Well, the electoral system, for one. There's still not really a clear-cut set of laws governing things like the verification of the vote. You know, that was a big deal in the 2020 election. You know, they had like this old electoral law from the 1870s that governs what happens if there's a dispute about certification and verification of electoral votes for the president. And that law is written in such a way that, you know, at the time it was written, it served its purpose, but now it's open to vulnerability. Ideally, people wouldn't try to abuse it in the first place, but the horse is kind of out of that barn at this point. So we kind of need to update the law to try to limit the temptation that actors may face in the future who may wish to try to abuse existing electoral laws. There's already an electoral law that's been proposed and written up that could do that. I haven't written the details about it, but there's been intermittent talk about that since late 2020. Nothing's come of it yet because Congress has been focused on other priorities, but ideally that's going to be passed. And I think it'll probably have maybe not complete bipartisan support. Obviously, there's actors who would not want that, but I think overall the establishment wings of both parties are pretty eager for that. So I think there may not be as much opposition to that bill as there has been to other mainstream bills that have been passed or have been attempted to be passed over the past year or two. So that's a big problem. And hopefully they'll kind of take a crack at that. There's also the Joe Louis Voting Rights Act. I think that's also on the books to try to tackle some of the issues with voting restrictions. You know, some of that is overblown. I mean, it's not inherently a problem to have a stricter regime as far as verifying who's voting. You know, that's some. So there has been some. What would you call it? Hyperventilating, I guess, in the media about that. And there has been some studies that have shown that it has voting restrictions that have been passed have not had a statistically significant impact on election outcomes thus far. But at the same time, the voting restrictions do have a partisan element to them, and there have been a few politicians who have openly admitted that they have a partisan impetus behind them rather than an objective impetus intended to just make elections more secure.
Mm-hmm.
So the Joe Louis Voting Rights Act would try to address that aspect, although I'm sure there's going to be a lot of counter arguments that assert that it's an overextension of federal power and that it's going to unreasonably subject certain regions of the United States to government oversight that is not needed. All of which is debatable, but in general, it at least tries to address that problem, which is a positive. Government trying to address problems is something we haven't seen enough of in the United States for the past couple, 10, 20 years or so, if not further. I guess there has been attempts. Maybe I shouldn't say try, but there hasn't been a lot of significant effort, at least not like positive, thoughtful effort put into trying to solve problems. A lot more of it has just been for show.
Doing it to build some quick clout for yourself.
Wow. Yeah, there's never any shortage of that. I guess as far as other political problems, you could point to something like populism, but that's sort of a nebulous, ambiguous type problem. That's not really the kind of thing you can legislate away. That's just more of a broad-based social issue that has to do with legitimacy of government and discontent with institutions.
Chad is asking if it's the John Lewis Act, not the Joe Lewis.
Did I get the name wrong?
Joe Lewis is a boxer, they're saying.
All right. Yeah, it probably is John Lewis then. Voting Rights Act. Yeah, John Lewis. There it is. All right. My apologies. My mistake.
All good. John and Joe are pretty close to each other. One of those Lewises.
Well, I guess I'll throw in the usual disclaimer. Now, now's a good time, probably. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, at times painfully, embarrassingly obvious. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation in chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. Yeah, it's nice getting feedback in chat. I always learn something every time we do this, including how to pronounce bills correctly.
Yeah, the viewer who gave the correction said they're from Detroit, and half the stuff there is named after Joe Lewis, the boxer.
Oh yeah, I guess he was he would have been pretty famous up there, right?
Hmm.
Well, let's see. I think also there's been a big push to try to reform. I guess this is another form of electoral reform, but basically there's been a shift towards ranked choice voting, because obviously the first past the post voting system has some significant flaws to it. It's not entirely unworkable, but when you get a large country with a great deal of diversity in terms of political preferences, it can get pretty unwieldy. So ranked choice voting is an attempt to try to address that. And you don't necessarily need like a full constitutional overhaul to shift towards ranked choice voting. So it's a particularly attractive solution for that reason. And there's been some experiments with ranked choice voting that have been relatively successful. Relatively less radical candidates have been winning primaries and elections, and some of that has been attributed to ranked choice voting in those elections where it has been implemented. Yeah, people should vote in primaries. That's a big part of that's a big contributing factor anyway to political dysfunction in the United States right now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the segment of the population that votes in primaries is not really representative of the voting electorate as a whole. And the result is that basically the most partisan voters are narrowing options in elections for everybody else.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't really be able to do that as much if everybody else also participated in primaries. So that's an easy solution to that problem just right there. But
yeah,
again,
the people
like
who
I said
are
earlier,
in the primaries are more try hard, and they usually have a stronger political stance than people who are closer to the middle.
Yeah, exactly. But like I said earlier, getting people engaged in politics is hard. So getting the more moderate vote out is inherently difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, those are some other problems besides media concentration that are more pressing, I would argue.
So more so than the way that news is dealt out would be the way that voting is done.
Yeah.
And just having a more robust, less exploitable system. Would you say that some of those issues that you mentioned are kind of linked with a lot of how the election was brought into question by Trump losing? Because the laws
obviously
are kind of old, that's one of the reasons why they focus on it so hard.
Well, It's not so much that the laws are old. I mean, democratic, any set of institutions in a democracy are invariably going to be flawed somehow. Like, you can write as many rules and protections as you want to try to discourage and punish people for trying to abuse political institutions, but invariably, if they really, really want to, and they have enough popular support to do so, it's going to happen. Like, you cannot realistically stop it in those circumstances. So the issue is not necessarily just that the laws are old and have lots of loopholes and stuff. The issue is that there's a lot more demand now politically to break them and abuse them that did not exist before.
Because the norms have changed?
Because norms have changed, because there's more discontent towards established institutions, because those institutions are less legitimate. You know, there's a lot of long-running political problems that have been unresolved and, you know, to a degree cannot be resolved. But people don't really think of problems as being unresolvable. They tend to think of them as being inflicted by somebody or something somewhere. And so if the government is unable to resolve it, then that means that somebody somewhere is stopping it from resolving them. People don't like hearing that a problem is just interminable and that they have to just sort of get used to it and find ways around it rather than trying to push directly through it. That's not a vote winner. You're not going to win elections with that kind of campaign platform. But yeah, we've gotten more of those kinds of problems, and institutions have taken a knock accordingly. And so people are looking for easy solutions to complicated problems, for which there are always going to be politicians offering. And that's what we've got. So how do you deal with that? I don't know. It's a difficult question. Ideally, people would recognize that whatever kinds of problems they face, democratic institutions are inherently valuable unto themselves, and that their norms should not be violated, so as to preserve them for the future, so that future generations can also enjoy the kind of stability that democratic institutions and norms provide. But that's a hard sell. And it's sort of an abstract idea, and people don't really like abstract ideas. You know, they like meat on the table. You know, they want to have something tangible they can point to and say, okay, this is a good thing. I want to preserve this for the future. I'll fight for that. But the more complicated the argument or idea or thing is, then the less likely they are to do that. So that's more the issue rather than the laws just being old. It's that the overarching political environment, if not the overarching sort of socioeconomic environment, has changed so much over the past, you know, couple decades, if not half century, that there are new stresses now on the political system, that it is not, that really no political system is going to be well disposed to deal with. So how we navigate this era of pressure is not going to come down necessarily to the design of institutions. It's going to come down more to the balance of political power between people who want to tear down political institutions, or at least violate democratic norms, and those people who want to protect those norms. And that's sort of a bigger picture battle that's going to play out over the next, 10, 20 years. Institutional redesign and upgrading and, all the kinds of reforms that we talked about today and, in previous episodes, that's all going to be part of it. Those are all viable solutions and worth talking about. But sort of the bigger macro picture is just how much demand is there to fight for established institutions, and just upgrade them as necessary, as needed, as opposed to people who don't trust those institutions at all and feel the need to entrust political power with specific actors who don't necessarily themselves care about democratic norms or institutions, and rather are just promising to give something in return to their voters, probably something like, money or benefits or whatnot in exchange for their votes. It's more of a patronage type system rather than a democratic system. In that case, anyway.
Yeah, I think a big part of it too is like you were pointing out, abstract versus simple. A lot of people on the voting end are going to be wanting the end result, and that is what matters to them more so than how it happens and how robust the system that creates the end result is. It's like, are my taxes too high or too low? Are my health services good for what I'm paying for? That kind of stuff. Like, they're going to be looking at their own finances, their own budget, and a lot of people are voting more so along those lines rather than trying to understand the institutions on a basic level and then try to tune them. I think we benefit from a lot of the really like stable institutions that we have in the US, but we don't realize it. Like having some level of bureaucracy is good because that means that you have procedure and you're organized. But bureaucracy is kind of a dry and boring word where you think of it as being bad. You think of government as being bad, but at the end of the day, you do need some governance to just not have thug and bandit rule. Yeah. So how can that be done in an elegant and fair way is a big question.
Yeah. And everybody's got their opinions on how to do that, which are frequently conflicting in nature.
Mm-hmm.
So good luck reconciling all that.
Yeah, I was talking with a friend recently about the vaccines and COVID and all of that stuff, and how one of the routes that we took that I'm not sure if that was the right idea was to, in places where you're trying to get people vaccinated, you would focus really hard on it being something they should do for their part as a member of a larger society, but not really going into just some of the nuts and bolts of how the mechanisms of action work in the vaccine, and how that would give a lot of people, I think, much greater security in putting something foreign in their body and knowing that, okay, I understand at least roughly how this works. I trust the science behind it, so I'm going to do this for the benefits of it with that knowledge at my disposal. I feel like it wouldn't be that hard. Like if you get some people who are good communicators in the sciences to push that a little bit more and then find some boiled down explanations for how things work. Basically, you're not trying to give them the scholarly process for how the mRNA vaccines were made and the full history there, because people have a short attention span. But if you can give them some infographics of where they're getting the materials for it, how they interact with your body, and then also places they can go for additional resources if they want to learn more, I feel like it would have been a lot less politicized if it wasn't just a, you should do this to play your part, or you should not do this because you should be independent. It fell into the individualist collectivist decision making rather than the just explain the mechanics of the medicine, and if people don't want to take it based on how it mechanically works, then more power to them. They don't have to. But yeah, it was something that I feel like most people can't explain how it works. They either took it or they didn't, and the reason for it ended up being something that was more emotional rather than scientific.
Yeah.
So you
go ahead.
You could basically apply the same thing to understanding institutions and how they work. Is we end up boiling a lot of these things down to some emotional government bad, this branch bad, and then just taking a really ham-fisted approach to stuff rather than, okay, if we want to really fine-tune this, we do need to at least have representatives who know how it works. You don't need the full U.S. public to understand the nuances of government. That's the politician's job. But the politicians at least should, I think, be studying and treating their job like they're students of governance and trying to really convey what's going on and how the balance can be shifted for the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well put. But again, the underlying problem is that the politicians getting elected, a lot of them don't exhibit those features, right? And they're getting elected because there's genuine political demand for that.
Mm-hmm.
And how you address that is like the broader problem. Like, how do you do that? Like, is it just something that's transient? Like, is the collapse in public confidence in certain institutions and certain segments of the public, is that just a transient thing that kind of goes away with time? Or is it something you have to address somehow with some kind of populist public policy that achieves some particular set of objectives? Or is this kind of problem only sated by sort of a broad-based collapse in established institutions that are then supplanted by new, more popular institutions? Like, I don't know what that looks like. There's some precedent in like the early 20th century when there were broad-based market failures, during the Great Depression, and there was a sense that something new was coming of some kind, and so there was a big push to try to maintain existing institutions. That was not guaranteed to succeed. There was no inherent reason that American democracy had to survive the Great Depression in the 1930s, and there was a great deal of angst and commentary, pondering that very question. But as it happens, we had a leader, Roosevelt, who was pretty populist in nature. We don't really remember him as a populist, but a lot of the positions that he took were in that vein. And he took the power he got from those positions and used it to reinforce rather than deconstruct American democratic institutions. So in a sense, we got lucky. We had a populist moment, but the leaders that won out ended up using that power pretty responsibly. Mm-hmm. There was never any guarantee that would happen, and there's no guarantee it would happen again, given the chance. There was a couple of leaders, even in the 1930s, that would have been happy to go in a different direction. There was one guy from Louisiana who was very popular and very sort of left populist in that time, who very well could have won the Democratic nomination and become president. What was his name? His nickname was Kingfish, but his name, I'm suddenly having trouble remembering it. It started with an H, I think. Huey Long, that's what it was. Yeah, one of the things he wanted to do was just broad-based subsidies and, money for the poor, that kind of thing. Much more so than what Roosevelt was talking about. In fact, I read a couple months ago that one of the reasons Roosevelt shifted left before the 1936 election, I think it was specifically in response to Huey Long kind of attacking him from the left and trying to push to get the Democratic nomination ahead of the election. Yeah, maybe he would have succeeded, but he ended up getting assassinated. There was he was from Louisiana, and Louisiana, for those of you who maybe are not from the United States listening, Louisiana is considered to have some of the most corrupt politics of any state in the United States of America. It is quite corrupt. It has a long tradition of that. And Huey Long, being from Louisiana, was just knee-deep in that. He was quite corrupt himself, and he was not above abusing his power to try to ensure people loyal to him won power in certain offices of state. And when he, one of the things that he did was to, I don't remember specifically what office it was, but he basically prevented some dude who was not loyal to him from winning office. And his son, that is to say, the son of the office holder who had been, attacked by Long, and who lost his position, was very frustrated with Huey Long. And when Huey Long was walking through, I think it was Baton Rouge one day, he just opened up on him with a handgun. And Huey Long had bodyguards. It was kind of known that there were radicals of one sort or another who wanted to kill him. But they weren't able to stop Huey Long from getting shot. They did gun down the assassin. He was thoroughly shot, but Huey Long took at least one bullet in his abdomen, and that ended up killing him. Hmm. And so that was the end of him.
I did not know that story.
Yeah, there's always a Huey Long somewhere in U.S. politics. They don't always have the opportunity to win a lot of support, because generally things are sufficiently stable that their message does not resonate. But these are not general times. So, of course, there's a lot more resonance to those kinds of messages from people like Huey Long. And so we see many more Huey Long type figures in American politics these days.
People who are very much willing to win at all costs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they say what they need to say to get votes, regardless of whether or not they can actually do anything that they promise.
Or that they believe what they're saying on like a personal level.
Or even that, yeah. There's a lot of politicians for whom politics is more of a game for their own personal self-aggrandizement rather than achievement of particular ideological objectives. Mm-hmm. That's actually really more the norm around the world in democracies and different places. Most democratic political systems are not really manned by politicians whom are really chasing a particular ideological goal. Most of them are just sort of in it to run a patronage network that enriches themselves and their patronage network members. I've been reading more about India's politics over the past couple weeks. I have a book, India Turning Point or something. I don't quite remember the title, but it was written in the early 1970s. And even in the 1950s and 60s, Indian politics was pretty self-interested. Lots of politicians were just joining parties because they saw it as an avenue to become wealthy and powerful. You know, before independence, before India became independent, being a member of Indian National Congress, which was the principal independence group in India, fighting to get India independent of the British Empire, most of the people who joined were driven by nationalism. You know, they had a genuine ideological interest in an independent India that was free of British rule. And it was risky to join the INC because, of course, you know, the British didn't want to leave, and so they would pass this, that, or the other measure to restrict Congress's activity. And those measures could easily involve you being arrested and and getting imprisoned for a prolonged period of time. So generally, you kind of had to want to pursue the organization's goals to join in the first place. You know, the fact that it was risky acted as a filtering mechanism. But after independence, there wasn't really that same risk. You know, really, it was just opportunity. It was a powerful organization. It had access to the levers of state. So that meant there was a lot of possibilities for self-enrichment and building patronage networks. And because there was no risk of arrest, you know, for joining the party and running, lots of opportunists started spilling into the party's ranks after independence, and that problem became worse with time. So that's a common phenomena, you know, all over the world. And it's not even just in the developing world, you know, it also happens in the developed world. The developed world does a little better just because we have large middle classes that are not as dependent on patronage networks. You know, if you go back to the United States in like around the year 1900, we had lots of very poor immigrants coming in. And established public services for them were insufficient, to put it mildly. And there was a lot of demand for public services. So what would happen is that there would be politicians who would promise to provide this, that, or the other public service, legally or illegally, on condition of people voting for them. And so that created a number of patronage networks all over the United States that were pretty robust for several decades. And, you know, again, a lot of them really depended on the votes of those poor migrants. But immigration was cut off in the 1920s. And there was pretty significant growth over the course of the 1920s and then later on after World War II in the late 40s and 1950s. And that created a pretty robust middle class that didn't really have as much demand for public services. You know, more public services were provided anyway, but also in general, people were able to kind of buy stuff for themselves. You know, they were able to afford a good life without the need for significant government assistance. And so that curtailed the opportunities for patronage network construction. And that in turn undermined established patronage networks in the United States. There was also a big political movement in the United States that was sort of spearheaded by the progressive movement. You know, progressives did a lot of stuff, but one of the things they did was fight against patronage networks. They wanted to destroy political machines because they saw them as inherently corrupt and undermining the spirit of liberal democracy. And so they went out of their way to try to vote for progressive candidates that did not engage in those kinds of patronage building activities. So progressivism, the rise of the middle class, and the decline of immigration, all of that kind of served to undermine patronage networks and political machines in the United States. So we don't have as many now. You know, we still have some. They never went away fully, but they have been marginalized to some of the more marginal communities in the United States. You know, the poor African American community, especially in some of the poorer urban areas. They still have political machines. Chicago writ large still has political machines. And then there are some rural areas in poorer parts of the country that still have them. But as far as like suburbs, you know, the richer part of modern metropolitan areas, and even in the cities, you know, the smaller cities, sort of tier 2, tier 3 cities, you don't see it nearly as much there. It's pretty uncommon. And it's, you know, the same you could extrapolate to like Western Europe or Japan. Well, partly Japan. Japan's kind of its own animal, but yeah, in general, those places don't have as much of that kind of politics, specifically because they're more developed and there's less demand for it.
Heckin' middle class stopping all of our corrupt opportunities.
Well, it's not entirely a good thing, though, because the middle class, while they want cleaner politics, they're not always interested in investing in public services. And it was the lack of public services that kind of created, or at least provided the impetus for the creation of those patronage networks in the first place. So, on the one hand, yes, American politics is much cleaner, but you could argue that there's actually less provision of public services of one kind or another to the most needy communities because political machines that cater to those needs are not as powerful or endowed with resources as they used to be. So, like a lot of things in politics, it's trade-offs. Right? You
Yeah.
get some good, but then you have to give something up for it.
Yeah, it seems like the middle class would have a lot less interest in improving inner cities. Like, you don't need buses, you don't need trains, you don't need different kinds of health services and stuff downtown because you live in the suburbs and you're more or less self-sufficient. So you would be happy if the government did basically jack shit except protected you from enemy countries.
Yeah. Yeah, and suburbs in the United States tend to be more conservative, so you can see that phenomena play out at the polls.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that you can measure quantitatively, even, in so much as you can extrapolate sort of the more conservative side of American politics onto that greater interest in self-sufficiency and relative lack of interest in public services. So some of that is changing. The middle class in the United States has been somewhat bifurcated almost over the past couple decades on account of globalization. The upper middle class is actually doing really good to the point where I kind of suspect that they're actually one of the main drivers of inflation right now. A lot of people talk about things like, the rising cost of energy, supply chain disruptions, stuff like that. But actually, there has been like just a secular rise in demand in the US economy. And it's actually, I think it's the largest in the world. Over the past, since the recovery from COVID kind of started in late 2020, there's been a huge boom in consumption in the United States. And that is disproportionately driven by the upper income brackets, which is where the upper middle class is more located. So that part of the middle class is actually doing really good. But at the same time, the lower middle class, which is a weird turn of phrase, but it's the part of the middle class that's not in the upper middle class, they're struggling more. The structure of the economy has not changed over the past couple decades in a way that is favorable to the working class in the United States. Generally speaking, you can find some pockets where they do better, but in general, they've come under more pressure because the segments of the economy that have a comparative advantage in the globalized economy in the United States are not the ones that really employ working class people, or at least are disproportionately parts of the economy that employ more upper middle class people. So as a result, there's been more wage stagnation for the working class in the United States in real terms over the past 30 years than there is amongst other income brackets. So that's resulted in a lot of pressure for them. And part of the impact of that has been a greater, I don't want to say like full-on radicalization politically of the working class in the United States, but definitely there's been a curtailing in the perceived legitimacy of the state amongst that particular voting group. You can see that particularly in the Rust Belt in the Midwest and in other areas that are more working class in nature, or that have historically been more working class in nature. In those areas, there's been a particular political demand for greater public services, greater public supports and protections. And a lot of that demand was unmet, especially in the early part of the period of globalization, because there was for one, they were still in decline at that time. That had kind of been an ongoing process. It wasn't just globalization that caused that, but globalization kind of accelerated and exacerbated it. 1990 is just roughly the period of rapid expansion of globalization that people like to use when they talk about globalization, but you can go further back. Anyway, without going into too much of a tangent about the exact nature of timing globalization, we can roughly point to early 90s. So at that time, there was still a pretty large middle class, a working middle class anyway, that you could point to. It was in decline and had been in decline, but it was still relatively large. So there had not been as much of a political impact of that decline yet. So it kind of took time for the middle class to shrink more and to feel more of the pressures that came with structural changes in the economy before you started to see real substantive political consequences. And also, there was a sense that globalization would prove in the medium to long run to be a net positive for the economy, and that everything would kind of work out eventually. Eventually there will be sectors of the economy that do really well, and then we can tax those, redistribute it, and then the people who have lost out from globalization can be compensated, and they'll have new avenues towards by which they could climb the social ladder and build a livelihood for themselves. So that was the logic for a very long time, probably up until like maybe 2015 or so. I think there was a well-known book in economics that was written around then that actually took a look at the data over the previous 20 years and found that actually, while the economy had benefited from globalization, the impact had been disproportionately concentrated in industrial areas of the country, and that those people had not gotten better or been compensated, or basically had not in any way really benefited from it. They had gotten absolutely hammered, and that this was probably why people were so upset with globalization, even in parts of the country that had done relatively well in the period of globalization. So after that, you really saw more political upset, amongst the working middle class. And of course, from there, you end up with phenomena like Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, the whole menagerie of left and right-wing populists that's really gained attraction since that period. That was really the genesis there. And it hasn't really abated since then. There's been some disquiet on the count of some of the things the Trump administration did. That created some impetus for some moderation in American politics, but that underlying driver has not really been resolved yet. The working middle class in the United States is still struggling to kind of find its footing in a globalized economy, and it's not really clear how they're going to be able to do that, or if they can do that, and just what role government is going to play in that. So as a result, there's still a lot of political demand for things like trade protection, subsidies, wage protections, unionization, etc. And that's coming from both left and right now. It's not just sort of people on the left that have traditionally pushed for more labor protections and labor supports. People in sort of the national conservative movement, as it's come to be known, have been pushing for more of those kinds of things. They have different policies by which they would try to achieve it than people on the left wing, but they have nominally the same goals, which is itself a big change from the status quo. If you told me even 10 years ago that the Republican Party was going to transition into a working class party, I would have thought you were crazy, because that's just not where it was in 2012, right? But the changes have come rapidly in the time since then. And it's not really fully a working class yet, but there's the national conservative wing of the party at this point is pretty thoroughgoing in its working class tastes. And that takeover thus far has really only been interrupted by some of the bigger scandals that have happened over the past couple years, especially the January 6th stuff in 2020. Mm-hmm. But whether or not the establishment wing can kind of staunch them is the big question people have been watching for the past, 2 years since January 6th. They've had some success. It's looking like the growth in the populist right is slowing, but it's not entirely clear just what the balance of power is between the establishment and the what you might call the new right, as it were, in the Republican Party. So that remains to be seen.
The 2012 right would be more skewed toward like the suburbs and the middle class.
Yeah, that was very much the era of the Tea Party right, which was very much middle class right. The kinds of guys who have pretty decent jobs, but also watch a lot of like Fox News. Glenn Beck was a big deal back then. He was very popular. So that was sort of more the center of the party. It was an establishment part of the party. They weren't really asking to do things that the party had not always wanted to do, but they asked more forcefully and more radical about, the kinds of policies that through which they would achieve it. They asked more specifically for a shrinkage in public services and smaller government and whatnot. But since then, the party has done a 180 and is shifting, in a very different direction. The Tea Party right has some things in common with the Trump movement, the National Conservatives, in so much as they're both relatively more radical than what had come before. But in terms of policies and objectives, they're very different, and they don't really get along very well. Glenn Beck himself, after he'd kind of stepped down from his show and stepped away from politics, commented on the Trump movement back in like 2016, 2017, and said that he didn't really recognize it as being conservative. He thought there was a lot of troubling aspects to it.
That's interesting to think about. I do remember when he was a very big name. Bill O'Reilly is also out as well. We have kind of like a new guard of conservative pundits, and their tone and vibe is pretty different.
Yeah, very sort of aggressive and sort of almost, what would the word be? Almost like a human tabloid, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
What was his book? He had a book that had a really pretentious name. What was it? A bold, fresh slice of humanity? Something like that.
Whose book is that?
Bill O'Reilly.
Oh.
Yeah, A Bold, Fresh Piece of Humanity, a memoir by Bill O'Reilly. Yeah, they love hamming it up for the cameras. That's not just a right-wing pundit thing. That's a pundit thing generally.
Yeah, you want a spicy title.
Yeah.
You don't want to undersell what you're doing, so overselling it is like the safe bet.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been some guys on the left who have done that. Who was the guy back during the Bush administration who got really famous for doing that? Was his name Keith Olbermann?
That name sounds familiar.
I think that's the guy, Keith Olbermann. He had been a sports broadcaster, but then he went on this big tirade on camera against the Bush administration, and he ended up getting into political commentary, and he got to be a really famous pundit on the left wing of the political spectrum. Yeah, he kind of went away after the Bush administration, though. That was, a lot of political pundits kind of get famous by bitching out a particular administration, and the result is that they have a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
And when that administration leaves, then they don't really have their modus operandi anymore. And they frequently fail to adjust.
That's actually one of the lines of Illidan whenever you beat him in WoW. There's a huntress who's been chasing him all this time, and he says, "You're nothing without me." Joker also says similar stuff to Batman.
Yeah.
Where it's like you take the opposite stance, which means that by them existing, you are inherently more powerful and you have more sway than if they didn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, there's always figures like that.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, they wouldn't have as much support as they do, but, underlying structural changes and whatnot have changed the landscape. So the impetus is on people who want to preserve democratic institutions while trying to meet new political demands, to try to square that circle and to try to find a way forward that does not destroy democratic institutions, but upgrades them so that they're more resilient, while also trying to adjust some of the really difficult political and economic problems of the day. It doesn't sound like very sexy politics. It really sounds much more like a homework assignment.
Mm-hmm.
But that's about the only way that we're going to kind of make it through this era, with the institutions that have kind of undergirded American success intact. So good luck with that.
Thanks. Same to you. You're gonna need some luck.
Well, other than overarching structural flaws in American political institutions, was there any other topics you wanted to touch on here?
Well, other than that, chat asked about a Taiwan update, and there was another question that I already put in the queue. Where did I put that? Oh, yes, here. There was someone who's asking, Japan wasn't allowed to have a military, and they're wondering if there are any other major countries that were banned from having a military. They'd never heard of that before.
Probably none that you haven't heard about before. I'm only aware of two. Japan is one.
Germany's other?
Oh, no. Germany was never banned from having a military. Shit, the United States wanted them to have a military.
Oh.
Well, yeah. I mean, look at the map, right? Because West Germany was like right on the border with East Germany, of course, and that's where the demarcation was between East and West. So if there was going to be World War III between the Soviet Union and the United States, it would have been fought right there. West Germany was the front line in the Cold War. And that being the case, if West Germany is going to be sort of the sword and shield, right, the first line of defense against communism, you want them to have an army. That's just inherently helpful. So the United States and its other allies were pretty open to the idea of Germany maintaining a military, especially in the early 1950s. And so there was never the same impetus for the German Constitution to ban the military, ban to not have an army, like Japan was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the threat of communism was just too real, that was just too ever present. It was a little different in Japan. They had part of the impetus there was, communism was definitely part of the impetus, but there was also a very strong pacifist movement after World War II. You could argue that Nazism was relatively popular in Germany, so there was like some impetus to continue to have a military just because the idea of having a strong military was sort of part of the appeal. But with Japan, militarism was definitely popular, but there was also a lot of liberals and other factions that had to be suppressed. And so they really kind of took the opportunity to drive home just how badly the militarists had screwed over Japan after the war. And so the pacifist message really, really resonated because the military had seized control, the militarists had supported them, and they all said that Japan was going to become a great empire and everything was going to be awesome. And then all of the cities were destroyed. There was a famine that starved, hundreds of thousands of people, and they got nuked. So all told, very bad policymaking on the part of the militarists.
Yeah.
They did not deliver on their promises, and the pacifists said, this is what you get when you vote for them. You should listen to us and allow us to design new political institutions in the Constitution. So in effect, that's what happened. And of course, the United States was quite willing to oblige during the occupation. We actually wrote the Constitution that they ended up voting on. But they've had lots of opportunities since then to change it. But the pacifists have just been too strong in Japanese politics to really allow that to happen. Doesn't mean it hasn't been watered down. I mean, effectively, Japan does have a military. But that just means that the pacifists have basically an even better argument. They say that why do you need to change the Constitution when we already effectively have a military that suits our purposes? Whatever threats are out there does not require us to change our pacifist Constitution. We have already adjusted our interpretation of the Constitution enough to allow us to deal with those problems.
Do they actually have a military there, or is it just like heavy drilling equipment? We joked about that before. I think of like mining stuff and how you could call something by a different name, but everybody knows what it actually is.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole helicopter destroyer thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not a carrier, which is banned by the Constitution. No, it's a helicopter destroyer that is also equipped to handle F-35 fighter jets.
It's just a tack-on feature,
Oh yeah, a little extra there.
Yeah.
But yeah, West Germany definitely had a military. And it was actually the largest army in Europe, I think, other than, second largest. I think the Soviet army was bigger. But in NATO, West Germany had the largest army, and it was well-funded, well-equipped, and, it was ready to go. Like, nobody in West Germany was eager. Well, most people in West Germany were not eager for communism. Certainly not Stalinist communism, which would have been the case in, late 40s, early 50s. So the Germans had a very powerful army right up until the end of the Cold War, and then after that they really jumped into the peace dividend and picked it apart, and at this point there's not a whole lot left. They've been trying to spend relatively more since 2014, but it's still nowhere near Cold War levels. But yeah, as far as countries that do not have militaries, Japan technically, as far as the Constitution, although in practice it actually does. And then Costa Rica does not have a military. And that was by design. There was a coup back in the 40s, and people were very upset about that. So they voted in politicians who changed the Constitution to just get rid of the army completely. So they haven't had to worry about it since. China technically does not have a military. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. The Chinese government does not actually have a military. You know who does have a military in China is the Communist Party of China.
Yo, that would be fucked up if we had like a Democrats military and a Republicans military, and how like politicized that would be. Oh my gosh, I'm glad that's not the case.
Yeah, it's probably better to have the state have it, at least in a U.S. context. But in China, the Communist Party did not want the state to have its own, basically, enforcement arm. The party wanted to make sure that it monopolized violence. Now, given party-state fusion, which is basically the approach to governance that was designed by Mao Zedong, there's not a lot of difference between the state and the party anyway, so it doesn't really mean anything. But at the same time, they wanted to make sure that there was no possibility that the state would ever obtain any kind of independent discretionary decision power separate from the party. And so by having its own military, the state maybe would be tempted at some point to turn on the party. So in order to preclude that completely, they just said, okay, the state doesn't have any kind of armed forces. China's armed forces instead will be purely controlled by the party and the party apparatus. And actually, the Chinese army, the People's Liberation Army, is actually controlled by a commission that is staffed by a mix of generals and Communist Party appointees. And the head of the commission is always the guy who heads the party. So there's sort of a three-way mix, right? The head of the party is also the head of state and is also the head of the Civil Military Commission that controls the People's Liberation Army. So those are all sort of separate institutions. In fact, the army itself is actually technically itself a separate institution from the party. It is still controlled by the party, just by way of that commission. But organizationally, it's actually a third entity separate from the party and the state. And that also was by design. They wanted the army to be its own thing so that it could kind of maintain ties with the people, so that it would always be a people's organization and not purely a bureaucratic entity that was controlled by the party. I don't think it worked. There's lots of bureaucracy in China. So I think that aspect of governance that they were trying to go for was not really achieved. But, really it was perpetual revolution is never really achievable. The romance of revolution fires revolutionaries, but it doesn't really fire many other people. Most people just want stability in day-to-day life. And so that always undermines revolutionary fervor eventually. And that's more what China has had since the Deng Xiaoping period. But regardless, they still have this weird organizational chart left over from that period, when Mao was in charge. And so technically, China does not have a military. But those are the only three I could think of.
Yeah, that just seems like you put the sticker on the building on a different side, but functionally speaking, they have a military.
Yeah.
That is really interesting too, that like the concept of a one-party state, it seems so weird to us, but it's like standard over there.
Oh yeah. I mean, the Communist Party went out of its way to make it normal. They've inculcated the concept amongst the population, so now it's just standard.
Would it have been the case, like way back in pre-communist revolution? Because they have the emperor and stuff, but then they've had warring states and things like that before then.
There were definitely multiple parties in China before the communists took power. Yeah, it's true that the emperor, during the period of the Qing dynasty, did not allow modern parties or anything like that. But there was a period of revolutionary activity in the late 1800s and early 20th century amongst radical reformers when they would form secret societies in order to overthrow the emperor and create a republic in China. And they succeeded. They overthrew the government in, I want to say, 1912 or so. And that marked a period of instability, but it also marked a period of liberalization of the politics and economy of China. And during that period, there was a flourishing of political parties. The communists were among them, but there were also, monarchists, Republicans, social democrats, revolutionary socialists, just any kind of ideology you can think of, they had a party for it, for up to and including Enlightenment liberals, although they were not particularly popular. Yeah, eventually, most parties ended up sort of falling under one of two umbrellas. Either the Kuomintang coalition, which was led by the nationalists, as led by Chiang Kai-shek, or the communist umbrella, as led by the Communist Party. And there were some that were kind of outside of that rubric, but invariably, because they were weaker, they ended up siding with one or the other. And so when the communists took power, they basically just banned all other parties so that they could create their unified party state. Now, that said, there are actually a couple of other political parties in China. They're basically holdovers from the Civil War period, the period from the 1920s through the 1940s. These were the smaller political parties that allied with the Communist Party, and the party actually allowed them to continue to exist, but they're not allowed to compete with the party, right? They're put in what's called a consultative role. Their job is to consult the Communist Party with the concerns of their constituents, but they're never supposed to challenge the party or otherwise campaign to get greater support. Their role in the political system is institutionalized and fixed in place. It is not a dynamic role. They do not behave like normal political parties would in, say, an open political system. So technically there are other parties, but they've been sort of neutered effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think every year or every couple years they have a People's Consultative Conference, and all these other political parties will actually meet. And then they'll talk about pressing issues, and then they'll kind of give a report of some kind to the Communist Party, detailing, whatever concerns they have, or giving feedback on policies, or, whatever other items of interest that they've been tasked with commenting on.
Yes, you may have a party, but you can't do shit.
Yeah. Yeah, effectively, that's what it is. That's what it comes down to. Yeah, the Kuomintang were the main other party besides the communists. They probably would have won, too. They probably would have won the Civil War if not for World War II. I've read that a couple times. Mao Zedong himself is supposed to have said as much. There was a famous quote, or a famous anecdote anyway, where he was meeting somebody at a conference in China and supposedly said that really the communists should thank Japan, because if not for them, then Chiang Kai-shek would have remained leader of China, and all the peasants of China would have thought of him as a great leader.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, the Japanese invaded, the communists took control, and the peasants of China believed that Mao Zedong and the Communist Party were the great leaders. Peasants are pretty malleable folks.
Yeah, they don't have the best education level generally.
Yeah. That's pretty much a universal truism, regardless of context. You can see that in most political systems. Apparently including India. Again, I was reading more about India's political history, specifically 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, and I was surprised by the degree to which peasants, rural, uneducated peasants in India, how they voted, basically. I kind of thought that being a democracy, that there was some effort to try to educate peasants more on how democracy worked and how they should be voting their interests and whatnot. But it was apparently relatively limited, and in some cases there was virtually none. And so a lot of peasants kind of struggled to understand the whole institution of democracy. And it's taken some time for that to become sort of normalized within the context of traditional rural village society in India. One of the things I read, for example, is that a lot of peasants in India after independence especially like the first 20 years or so, a lot of the times they would just vote for their feudal lord because there were princely states in India. Like in British India, it's not as though the British directly controlled all of British India. Something like 40 to 50% of the territory in British India was actually controlled by Indian princes. And, they were allied, quote unquote, to the British or otherwise were protectorates of the British Empire, such that they were definitely a part of British India. But they had local autonomy within their territories. They were still very much the preeminent power there. And after independence, most of those princely states were dismantled, over time, but the leaders of the princely states, the previous royal families, were still allowed to participate in politics. And because those were sort of the leading figures of those societies before independence, a lot of peasants just defaulted to them. If they ran for office, then the peasants would just automatically vote for them almost as a sign of deference, because they'd always showed deference to them, right? They were the royal family. They were sort of, what's the old phrase? Divine right, right? They had divine right.
The right of kings.
Yeah, the right of kings. So that's why they were royalty. So if they run for office, obviously you should vote for them because they have the backing of God. So a lot of peasants did that, and as a result, a lot of royal families, or formerly royal families, were able to achieve office and maintain it for a pretty long period of time. That kind of manifested in some weird political outcomes. You would not think that peasants would vote for like an Enlightenment liberal party that wanted laissez-faire economics and stuff, but a lot of the poorer parts of India would actually vote for politicians like that. And the reason is that a lot of the princes of the old princely states had actually been educated in the West or otherwise had Western educations. And so they tended to think in terms of Western policy making, which at that time kind of leaned more to the right. It was more of a laissez-faire approach to politics. And as a result, India had relatively more laissez-faire politicians than you might expect. It wasn't enough to it was not enough to overcome the leftward shift in Indian politics after independence. In general, the Indian National Congress was more of a left-leaning institution, but I was surprised to find just how many liberals there actually were, in Congress after independence, because of this weird phenomenon. And I don't want to oversell the point. There actually were a lot of former princes who ran and won office who were more left-leaning, so that's also a factor. I think they were more in the south, though. That was more like Kingdom of Mysore and the Nizam of Hyderabad. I think those two areas in particular kind of produced royalty that were more left-leaning, because they tended to side more with Congress rather than voting into the Swatantra Party, which is the Freedom Party, which is sort of the liberal opposition in India in the early period of India's independence. Sometimes peasants didn't really understand voting. That also itself took some time to kind of teach them. There was in the book I'm reading, they had some stories about, incidents, some of the weirder incidents basically involving peasants who didn't know how to vote. So there was one guy, I should say, let me preface this, in India, because illiteracy has been a problem for a long time. It's gotten better recently, but historically speaking, there's been a lot of illiterate peasants in India. And so the political parties recognize that, and what they'll do is instead of instead of having ballots where they have the candidates' names, they'll actually have the party symbol. So every party has a symbol, and when people vote, they'll actually vote for the symbol rather than the name, written on the ballot. And so that resolves the issue with illiteracy, right? You don't have to be able to read to recognize a symbol. And generally, representatives of the party will come and campaign in villages to try to get people familiar with their symbol and their policy platform. So what would happen is that some peasants, there was at least one incident where a peasant wanted to vote for a political party that had a symbol that was a tree. But this guy didn't understand, that you check the mark next to the tree and then put it in the ballot box. He actually tried to put it in a tree. And that for him kind of made sense, right? You want to vote for the tree, so put the ballot in the tree itself. And there was another guy who filled out his ballot like normal, but he didn't want to give it to the electoral commission that was running the election in his area, right? You're supposed to put it in the ballot box that's controlled by the commission. But he went to the commission officer who was there, and he said that he wanted to give his ballot directly to Nehru, who was like the leader of India at the time, because he didn't trust the commission, right? He didn't think that they would actually register the vote. And they told him, like, you don't need to worry about it. Just put it in the ballot box and we'll count all of them. And he said, no, I don't trust you. And he walked right out of the electoral office. And as he was leaving, he said that he was going to give it to Nehru himself in person. So there's just lots of weird stories like this, basically, from that first couple of years after independence. It took time to familiarize the peasants with the idea of actually voting, the mechanics even of voting. Let alone the idea more broadly of voting for candidates who actually represent your own policy preferences.
Yeah, it does take a level of trust. You're talking about faith in institutions as a stat that a given country can have. Whenever you're first doing a vote, you're starting with basically trust level 0, where you're taking someone's word for something on a process that you don't even know how it works, and you've never seen it happen before. So it makes sense, like on a basic human level of, do I trust putting this piece into a box and I don't know what's going to happen to the box, versus knowing that I handed it to the person who has the political power.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, how did we get onto that?
We're talking about countries that don't have a military, and then we talked about China, and then we talked about peasants and voting.
Right.
Yeah, it was a roundabout, but we went places. Only the best tangents on World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, that's a good book. Let me see if I can find that. A little bit older.
There was also a question about China's economy and banking stuff is like bad right now or something.
Oh yeah. So the book is India, A World in Transition by Beatrice Pitney Lamb. It was published in like 1971. But yeah, it actually gives a pretty thorough accounting of politics in India in that period, as well as the economy and some other facets. Very, very interesting stuff, since, India just hardly ever gets coverage anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, banking, China. The economy in China is kind of squirrely right now, although that's kind of true of every economy at the moment. But yeah, as far as like banking goes, there's been an ongoing policy problem in China pretty much for the past, I want to say 20 to 25 years or so, basically since they started opening up and trying to develop a financial sector in China. And, the underlying issue here is shadow banking, which we've talked about before, although it might have been a while.
Shadow banks.
Yeah, shadow banks. So the issue is that China's economy has been growing, and the result is that people have been making more money. And making more money means, assuming you're saving money, making money means there are more savings. And of course, when you have savings, you want to invest it. You want to get a return on your money. So it's not just sitting under a mattress, right? Because inflation means that cash devalues with time. So it's better to invest it and get a return that's higher than inflation. So not only is your cash not losing value, but you're actually gaining money over time by investing. The trouble was that China did not have an institution that was capable of absorbing all of those new savings and investing it productively, because they didn't have a financial system really, right? It was a centrally planned economy. Even after the reform started under Deng Xiaoping, way back in the early 1980s, a financial sector was not like one of the main objectives. They were more interested in allowing people to set up manufacturing and services enterprises, restaurants, factories, stuff like that. It wasn't until the mid-90s that they started entertaining the idea of actually having an open financial system that would allow people and institutions, for that matter, to invest like they would in a normal sort of capitalist economy. They did have It's not as though they didn't have banks before that, but all of the banks before then were more state-owned banks. And they did not offer like a really high rate of return. You would put your money in the bank, but the bank didn't really do much with it unless it was like something mandated by the government. And the rate of return you would get for the investment was very low, which was not attractive for a lot of people. So the government started to open up the sector and allow people to form financial institutions, but they were very, very cautious because obviously financial institutions and financial sectors can cause a lot of economic problems if they're not well regulated. And the party was very paranoid about people losing their savings. So they very much took that process very slowly. And the result is that the economy sort of lapped them, so to speak. That is to say, the economy grew so much and the demand for investment grew so much and so quickly that it rapidly surpassed the regulatory supply of those kinds of institutions that could provide that. So just what that means in simple speak is that instead of taking their savings and investing them in regular banks that offered a good rate of return, a lot of the people would take their money out of the banking system almost altogether, and they would invest it in, property. Well, actually, that's the main thing. They would mostly invest it in property, in real estate, because that was the major growth. China liberalized its real estate market also in the mid 1990s. And the result is that property prices started to rise pretty quickly. And so that was seen as a very safe investment, not only because real estate is always in demand, but because the price was rising so much over time. And it was assumed that that would be a pretty sustained rise, given how fast China's economy was growing back in the day. So real estate was safe and it offered a good return, so pretty much everybody and their mother took their savings and invested in it. That was seen as the smart thing to do. But the trouble is that most of the banks in the country at that time did not invest in those products. And so they could not offer a high rate of return. So the whole market for real estate investment was dominated by, effectively, shadow banks. So a shadow bank is just like a generic term that refers to an informal economic actor that facilitates investment in real estate or in other products. So maybe it's a friend of the family, or maybe even a family member who knows about a project that is going to come online soon and offers you the opportunity to invest in it. And then you take the opportunity, and so you kind of get the inside track. You get to be an early investor and take advantage of it. Lots of economic activity in China happens by way of networks. That's I think that's called guangxi, although I might be mispronouncing it. But anyway, everything is done, most everything in China is done by network. So, a friend of a friend or a family member or a friend of a family member will come to you with an opportunity, you take advantage of it, and then you invest that way. And so some people made a lot of money doing this, and eventually they would offer, basically, their networks effectively would just expand because people would coalesce around them. But all of this was happening under the radar. It was all informal. And what that means is that none of it was really regulated per se. Like if a bank wants to go and invest in stuff in the United States, there's certain prerequisites that they have to meet, right? They have to have a certain amount of money in reserve. There are restrictions as to who they can lend to. They have to do due diligence. They have to do due diligence on the projects they invest in, and there's also deposit insurance that's regulated and required and mandated. If an investor loses some money in their account, because a project fails, they're guaranteed to get at least some of it back from the government, because by law the government protects a certain amount of deposits. So regulation helps pad the market. It helps provide a buffer between changes in the market and instability in the market and your actual money that you have in the banks. China doesn't have that. To a degree, it has it for the formal banks, but again, people kind of pulled their money out of the formal banks. And the investments that they were putting their money into and the people they were entrusting their money with did not offer those same protections. So while they're enjoying, investing in real estate, which they can't really do through the formal financial sector, they're also putting themselves at greater risk. Now, for a long time, that didn't matter much because the returns were high enough to kind of justify it. So people didn't complain. And in general, the real estate market was always going higher. So unless you just got scammed by somebody, you were doing okay. And that didn't happen enough to put people off. So what happened over time is that this shadow market for real estate ballooned. The Chinese economy was growing like almost 10% a year for a prolonged period of time. And it got to be like a $10 trillion economy, $15 trillion economy, $20 trillion economy. And all those trillions of dollars translated into trillions and trillions of dollars in savings. So a huge and growing amount of money was being put into the shadow banking sector by all of these people who were trying to save their money and invest their money into the real estate sector. And what that meant is that more and more money was sloshing around unregulated. And again, so long as the property market kept growing, it wasn't a problem. But eventually, something was going to happen to make it stop growing, either by dint of market mechanics or by dint of regulatory action. And the trouble was that the Chinese government didn't really know what would happen when that happened. Because again, if the whole market is underwater, if it's all informal, there's no regulatory oversight. The government doesn't really have data on it. And without data, without insight, they can't predict what kinds of impacts given policies will have, or even the impacts of given changes in the market. So when the market was relatively small, that wasn't too much of a threat. The government figured it could probably handle a potential property market collapse because the market was relatively small like 20 years ago. It's not relatively small now. Like the market now is measured in the tens of trillions of dollars. So if the property market declines, and if banks fail, and if people lose their savings, they're losing trillions and trillions of dollars. And it'll be really difficult for the government to handle that. I think it could, but that's getting ahead of things a little bit. But regardless, it'll be a major challenge, much more so than it was 20 years ago when the market was so much smaller. And so the government now has much greater impetus to try to bring the shadow market into the light. They want to formalize the market so that more of those savings that have been invested are protected by law and are relatively safe in formalized banks. And those banks themselves also are going to be relatively more responsible with how they lend. So the government has been taking action, continuously for the past 10 years, but in particular for the past 5 years, to try to reform the shadow market and formalize it and get more of that money into the safety of the formalized financial sector. They've also been trying to allow the financial sector to grow more organically so that there are more investment banks and other firms that specialize investment that can invest formally under the protections of the law, but also do so productively so that they can provide returns on returns on investment that's competitive with rates in the shadow market. So all of that has been relatively successful, but the shadow market has still been growing a lot. It hasn't, the formal sector does not provide enough opportunities or enough return on investment to fully squeeze out all of that money in the shadow market. And so the result is that shadow banking institutions have continued to grow and that the market is still invisible, but also dangerous. And that's a really bad combination for a it's a bad combination for any regulator, but it's an especially discomforting combination if you're an authoritarian one-party state that hates risk. Chinese political culture is in general relatively more risk averse. And if you're a bureaucrat in that political culture, the last thing you want is some unregulated set of actors running around potentially causing or laying the groundwork for a huge economic explosion that you're going to take the blame for, at least in part. So the government wants to take action. It's been taking action, but the impact of that action has not really been satisfactory. And so there's some question as to just how stable the Chinese economy actually is and just what's going to happen when the property market starts to decline. So the reason we're talking about this at all at this point is because that's exactly what's happening. Property markets are starting to decline. It's still early and it's not as bad as the media sometimes makes it out to be. I've talked with some friends in China about it, and they say that real estate prices are not actually declining that much. So it's not this big catastrophe yet. The decline could accelerate in future. And it's also worth pointing out that part of the reason for the decline is that localities in China, that is to say local government in China, has been going out of its way to make sure that property firms, that is to say real estate firms, cannot, or at least are not, selling property at a significant discount. Obviously, if prices are going to fall, that's going to be a significant catalyst for the kinds of financial crisis that I'm talking about. Localities know that they're going to get the brunt of that since they get so much funding out of taxing and participating in real estate markets. And so they've been trying to mitigate the risk by putting pressure on local real estate companies not to not to lower their prices too much in order to try to mitigate the decline in prices. So some of the fact that real estate prices have not declined much is artificial. That's not all just market forces determining that. But for now, anyway, market forces, a combination of market forces and government action has prevented a significant decline in real estate prices, such that crisis proportions have been reached. That could happen later, but for now, it's still very early stages. But that's the reason that people have been talking more about shadow banking in China and the real estate market. It's also worth mentioning that real estate construction in China is a big part of the economy. Some disproportionately large share of China's manufacturing is basically just real estate construction. So if there was a significant fall in prices, presumably the impact of that would be a collapse in the construction of new housing, or at least new construction projects. And that in turn would have a disproportionate impact on GDP and presumably then employment. So if that's the case, then there's going to be some kind of economic crisis, and it's not clear if China's government would have the resiliency and expertise to really navigate that without making it worse. Regardless, a significant decline in China's GDP would have knock-on effects for the global economy, since so many countries depend so much on China for so much trade. The impact would be relatively muted with, say, the United States or Europe or one of the developed economies. But a lot of the developing world depends on commodity markets, and a lot of commodity markets are disproportionately priced on Chinese demand. So any big change in Chinese demand will have a big impact in the developing world. So everybody would be impacted, either by primary effects or secondary effects. Regardless, it would be noticeable. You would hear about it in the news, for sure. But that's basically the problem. The shadow banking sector is huge in China, but it's also invisible, so the government doesn't entirely know what to expect. And because there are signs now that market is in decline, and that it might explode at some point, the government and also market actors, for that matter, are taking more action to try to deal with it. And whether or not they are successful is the trillion-dollar question right now. Can the Chinese government successfully navigate a significant real estate downturn that causes major waves in the shadow banking sector? And that's all very unpredictable right now. We really don't know. Now, if you asked me, for however little that may be worth, I think the Chinese government could handle it, but they would have to take dramatic action. The Chinese government has a lot of tools available to it that are not available to, say, Western governments. So, for example, if they really wanted to, they could just totally nationalize the real estate sector and also broad swaths of the financial sector. And they could use that as a tool by which to protect people's savings. So if there's a construction firm or a real estate firm that is looking like it's not going to be able to complete a project and make the money it needs to pay off its debts, to the point that banks are being threatened with insolvency because they have so many unmet liabilities, the government could just nationalize those real estate firms and then just pay their debt via taxes. So, at that point, financial crisis averted, banks get their money, no problem. And they could also use tax money to try to pay off people who have deposits who have investments in those construction projects, who looked like they were going to lose money. So they could also protect investors in that way by nationalizing the market. Another thing they could do is just monetize all of that debt. They could literally just credit those companies with money in accounts with the Chinese central bank. I think it's called the People's Bank of China. And, either of those solutions is basically inflationary. They're basically pumping money into the economy at that point. But they could sterilize the effect by limiting withdrawals. They could tell people that they can only withdraw so much money per month, basically. They've already done that with some of the banks that have started to fail in the past couple months. That has been a thing that's been happening also. That's also another reason for concern. But it's been pretty heavily localized thus far, and the government has been very proactive. So it's not, again, a crisis yet. But regardless, nationalization and or monetization are options, dramatic options, but viable options by which the Chinese government could keep a major financial crisis that might be called, but that might be instigated by a downturn in the real estate market. Now, the downside of those approaches is that, for one, there's moral hazard. I mean, if you know that the government is going to end up bailing out the sector, effectively, then there's not really much reason not to continue taking risky action. Some of it is just risky preferences amongst Chinese investors anyway. I mean, China's economy does not really benefit from the protection of rule of law. And so the downside of that, of course, is that there's a lot more risk. Like if you have a contractual dispute, it's entirely possible that your counterparty has connections with the government that they abuse to ensure a favorable outcome in any kind of arbitration. Or even if you get favorable arbitration, they can retaliate in a way by which you effectively lose anyway. So, like I said earlier, connections are very important in China. And so that's a mechanism by which to mitigate that risk. So there's already a lot of risk in China, and that inculcates risk tolerance amongst economic actors. So that makes managing moral hazard more difficult, because even if you take very strong action to punish people for being scammers or for taking inordinate risk in the financial sector, there's invariably going to be more people who do it just because they're used to taking risks anyway. But regardless, moral hazard is going to be a problem. Even if you do, say, execute the heads of a company who are engaging in corruption that resulted in a collapse in the company and depositors losing their money. Even executions are not really going to deter people in future. So moral hazard, that's a problem. Another problem is that they're basically, in taking these actions, curtailing the development of a modern financial sector. If you fully nationalize all these companies and whatnot, it deters people from setting up those companies. It doesn't prevent them from taking risks and setting up companies at all, but it does divert them into other sectors of the economy. And so that makes it relatively less likely that a healthy formal financial sector forms up that can actually productively invest people's money without inflating property bubbles or otherwise putting that money in a position where it's causing undue systemic risk in the economy, like it is now with the shadow banking sector. So there are definitely trade-offs as far as taking dramatic action. And those are the reasons why the Chinese government hasn't taken them yet. Hypothetically, it could have just stopped this whole process from even potentially unfolding just by nationalizing and monetizing debt right from the get-go. But that creates knock-on economic problems. And there are probably more than a few relatively liberal members of the Communist Party, whom do exist, whom are opposed to dramatic action specifically for those reasons. And so that's why you haven't seen that yet. It could happen later. It just depends on how bad things get. If things get really out of control, it'll definitely happen. I would say that with some confidence. I can't say with full confidence because China's politics are opaque, and who knows what they're really thinking. But in general, I would fully expect dramatic action on the part of the People's Bank of China and the Chinese government generally if a significant real estate downturn resulted in an unfolding financial crisis. So they would definitely do that much. But for now, they're trying to navigate it in a smarter way that achieves policy objectives, that is to say, formalizes the financial sector and secures people's deposits and prevents any kind of broader run on the banks, while at the same time avoiding any of the moral hazard or any issues with moral hazard or any other long-term challenges to China's development goals that would be upset by taking dramatic action to prevent a problem in the present.
Basically, they want to get rid of shadow banking, but they don't know how to do it cleanly without fucking up a bunch of other shit.
Yeah, that's a good Cliff's Notes approach to it. Yeah. Yeah, developing a healthy financial sector is difficult. Even in developed countries, they struggle with that. The problem that China has is that there's a mismatch between the level of development in the economy and the level of development of the formal financial sector. There's just so much money that wants to be invested, that people want to invest, and so little formal opportunities for that in the formal sector that the financial sector is effectively just the Wild West. Like there's no way for the party to really keep an eye on it or otherwise regulate it. So the whole thing is just a big question mark. And it's not really clear how to resolve that. It would be difficult in the best of circumstances, but now they're very much like not in the best of circumstances. If they screw things up, then they're screwing up like tens of trillions of dollars worth of investments, and people will be very upset. So the government has to tread very carefully here. Again, worst case scenario, they have to take the dramatic actions I mentioned, and that would be manageable. But that does create longer term problems for them in terms of the knock-on impacts. So they're still trying to avoid that. But if they wait too long, then maybe it gets to a point where even dramatic policy action can't contain it. It is hypothetically possible that the shadow banking sector in China is so large and that it is so entangled, not only with informal investments, but with the formal sector, as well as the public sector, that a downturn in financial crisis would just implode the entire economy. I think that's an outside possibility at this juncture, but again, without being able to see data for the shadow banking sector, not even the Chinese government knows how likely that actually is. Hence their concern.
Mm-hmm. Do we have shadow banks in the U.S.?
No, not really, unless you're like somebody who can't participate in the banking sector and has to rely on like local money lenders or something. But even there's got to be safer ways to invest. I mean, if you're that poor, you probably don't have that much money to invest in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe in that case, you prefer to just keep money in your mattress. I've heard that before. But yeah, our financial sector, especially in the United States, is just so massive and so complex that there's invariably always investment opportunities. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, not even that. I mean, just there are always brokers, there are always firms who are ready and willing and able to invest your money for you into projects that will give you a good rate of return, a return on investment. But even if you don't want to do that, there are invariably firms like venture capital firms or whatever, where you can just kind of invest your money yourself. Like you yourself can form a venture capital firm and just do your own investment. And there are lots of projects available to do that. But more importantly, there's a legal system that respects rule of law and that is reliable in arbitrating disputes that you can lean on to protect you if you screw things up. Like if you take a really risky investment and somebody tries to scam you, you've got the law on your side. And so that allows you to take relatively more risks with your money without unduly subjecting yourself to the risk of losing that money to this, that, or the other scammer or whatever other factor. So it's a much safer investment environment, and it's also a much more formalized, regulated environment in which investors are protected. Well, I guess that's the same. That's redundant. It's a safer environment because it's regulated and more formal, and also there are lots and lots of opportunities and projects to invest in. So there's a much greater diversity of investment projects available. Like in the United States, it's not the case that everybody invests just in real estate. Like there are other things you can invest in. You can invest in tech companies, you can invest in utilities, you can invest in local bonds, you can invest in a whole range of stuff. And so that diversifies things and makes it less likely that a downturn in one particular sector or industry of the economy will tank the whole financial sector. Things are much more balanced than that. So we have less risk overall.
And you're saying that China, relatively speaking, is a lot more all in on real estate?
Yeah,
just like definitely. That's what people do. Like if you have extra money, you just buy something somewhere.
Yeah. Talk to people from China. They'll tell you, like, what do you invest in? Well, I would like to invest in real estate. Mm-hmm. And that's what they save up money for. That's what they talk with their families with. I have a friend who basically negotiated with their cousins to pool money so that they could buy an apartment, not to, live in, just so that they could own it as an investment vehicle. So that's very common. Mm-hmm. I actually viewed an apartment while I was in Beijing with my friends. That was something on their schedule. They needed to do it. They'd been wanting to do it for a while, and I was kind of inconveniently there at the same time, so they just kind of took me along. That was a very weird experience. Well, I mean, like here in the United States, if you want to view an apartment, you can. Mm-hmm. But generally, the apartment complex tells the people who live there in advance so that they can be somewhere else.
Oh, the people who live there were just in there when they're doing the showing?
Yeah. It was super awkward.
Dude, that would be hilarious if we're like doing this show here and people just like walk into the room and this is where this is and we're like, who the hell are you? You'd probably recognize the landlord, but yeah, you get the point.
Yeah, yeah. It was just kind of weird. They were just sort of there watching TV, and there was a kid just playing, and then there was like half a dozen people, strangers, just sort of walking around, looking at the rooms, looking out the window. I had no idea what to do. Because I just felt, I mean, it's awkward in general, but it's also awkward because I'm like a foreigner, right? These people are just minding their own business, and now there's a fat American walking around their apartment. So like all I could think was to kind of keep my hands in my pockets and just look out the window and sort of nod approvingly. That's a nice view.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And over here we have this. Mm-hmm. Mm.
Yes. Mm. Yeah, very strange experience. You know, I'm glad I did it. It's memorable. I got a story out of it, but yeah. But that just kind of illustrates how important, you know, apartments and property are. Right? That's everybody focuses on that. That is the main way that people invest money. I feel like I was going to say something else, but I don't know, it slipped my mind. But anyway, yeah, that's the gist of it. Too much money in a single industry, and it's all done in the informal sector, so it's hard to regulate. And now there's so much money in it that it could destabilize the entire financial system. Oh, that's what I was going to say. So if it was like just the informal sector, it would still be a problem, but it would not be as much of a threat to the formal sector. But here's the thing. There's a lot of corruption in China. Like everybody knows it. It's just accepted. That's like a stylized fact about China's political system and its markets. So the trouble, though, is that the corruption means that even in the formal sector, there is exposure to all of that dangerous informal investment. They're not supposed to do it. There are lots of laws and restrictions that the formal sector is supposed to respect as far as not investing in a risky way. But because of corruption, they do it anyway, right? So when I say that the Chinese government wants to bring money out of the shadow banking sector, out of the informal sector, and bring it into the formal banking sector, that reduces the risk if they can do that. But the trouble is, even if they succeed, there's actually still going to be exposure to that risk. And that's just because of the corruption. Like even banks, like even the larger banks, will actually illegally invest money into the real estate sector. It used to be that they did this using what were called wealth management products. The idea there is basically that you would create a product with a third party, and that third party would take money from the bank and invest it in something, and they would promise a high rate of return. And of course, the banks would basically just say, well, I don't know what they're doing, but they're giving a good return, so it must be a good thing. And of course, what they're actually doing is just investing in real estate, which is what the bank wanted to do anyway. But to get around the law, they just outsource it. You know, it's kind of like subcontracting. Like a lot of Western companies will use subcontracting as a way to get around restrictions. Like you're not supposed to use child labor, right? But if you use a subcontractor and you make them, you know, pinky swear that they're not going to use child labor, then you can just say, hey, I'm respecting the law. And when it comes out that actually your subcontractor really was using child labor, which generally is the only way they can actually meet, you know, quotas and price targets, then the company can pretend to be surprised. They can say, well, it said in our contract that they wouldn't do that. I'm as shocked as you are. And so then they'll break off that contract with one subcontractor, and then they'll just do the same thing with a different subcontractor. It's a way of avoiding liability. So a similar phenomena happens in the financial system in China. You know, if you're a bank and you want to get around the law, you can just find somebody who will promise you a high rate of return and then do a deal with them. And that deal is generally in the form of a wealth management product, you know, quote unquote. And you can pretend to be surprised when it turns out they invested it all in real estate or whatever, and then just turn around to do the same thing again later. So this approach allows financial institutions to still benefit from the financial from the real estate market and get high rates of return. It also allows them to compete. Because one of the problems with having such large, successful shadow banks that can benefit from high rates of return on real estate is that it's attractive, right? Like if you can get a 10% if you could get a 10% return on investment with, some dude who's promising to invest your money in real estate in some city, and the alternative is to invest your money in a formal bank that is only promising you a 2% return on investment, the dude in the shadow market is going to be a lot more attractive. And it sounds shady as fuck just calling him some dude, but in practice, that's actually what a lot of people do. They'll go with the dude and they'll trust him because he'll generally know somebody, a mutual acquaintance, and the mutual acquaintance will vouch for them. And then based off of that, you'll trust them.
I'm kind of thinking of it like you're just in your neighborhood with your people who have a little bit of disposable income, and you've got a neighbor who knows a guy, and he can set you up with some pretty clutch properties that they end up making money from, and then they brag about to their friends, and then when their friends get enough money, they're like, I can send you to the guy, and he'll get you the good stuff, sort of thing. It sounds kind of like drug dealing since it's not official institutions and whatnot.
Well, effectively it is, because a lot of the projects and the intermediaries in the projects are themselves basically gray market actors. They're not really acting in a fully legal way. So it sounds super skeevy because it is skeevy.
Mm-hmm.
But because there's so much corruption in China's politics and because the markets and the money involved are so large, it's kind of unavoidable. There's not much you can do. But the point is that banks themselves basically have to invest in real estate because that's the only investment product that can offer a high enough rate of return to allow them to compete with the shadow banks. They're not supposed to do it, but again, they just find ways around the law. And so in that way, they're able to continue to compete.
Mm-hmm.
That still doesn't mean that people prefer them. There's still probably most people who are still investing via the shadow markets, but there's been some shift back towards the banks, partly on the back of government action, but then also partly as a result of this corruption in the financial sector. So it's large banks that do this, state-owned banks, small banks, local cooperatives. Basically, all of them are involved in this. So the formal sector is also exposed to the risk. And the government itself is exposed to the risk. Because here's the thing, local government in China has a lot of trouble raising revenue to pay for local government projects of one kind or another, or even just day-to-day expenses. And the reason for that is because of a change that was made in the mid-90s. Basically, the Chinese government wanted more power over localities and their decision-making. And so they actually limited their ability to collect revenue. More specifically, what they did is they required localities to send the vast majority of their revenue to the central government, whereupon government money would be redistributed back to the localities. And of course, they would be given that money with lots of strings attached, requiring them to honor this, that, or the other government mandate. So the idea was to make government control stronger. But in effect, what it did is force localities to find ever more creative ways to raise money. Because invariably the amount of money that the government sent back was not really enough, or at least according to the localities. Maybe in a lot of cases it was enough, but they just wanted more money, regardless. What happened is that localities started dipping into the private sector. And one of the main ways that they would raise money is by selling real estate. Because, of course, in China, government basically owns all the land. Like, even if you own an apartment or a house or something, it's not actually the case that you yourself really legally own that property. Rather, the government owns that property and they're quote-unquote leasing it to you. Now, this is kind of a technicality. In practice, you really do own it, but officially, technically, the government continues to own all of that property. And so what the government did then is it basically pushed farmers off of their land and gave them, below market compensation in doing so, and then just took that land and sold it to real estate developers. And it made a lot of money doing that. Principally, that was the main source of revenue for most localities in China for a very long time. And the government tried to crack down on it. They tried to allow them to raise, more taxes like the normal way. And they also tried to put more restrictions on the ability of localities to actually participate in real estate markets. But corruption basically prevented that from really working. Instead, what localities started to do is do the same thing that the formal sector banks were doing, which is to find a third-party intermediary and just sort of give them money as part of a quote-unquote wealth management product. to go and find some kind of investment that would give a high rate of return. And of course, invariably, that would come in the form of real estate, which the government would make available. So there are just lots of loopholes and forms of corruption that can be used to allow localities to continue to make money by selling real estate. So the significance of this then is if there's a massive financial crisis and, well, I should say if there's a massive downturn in property prices, localities will be cut off from this revenue. Now, maybe even that itself wouldn't be too big of a problem. It would result in cuts to public services. But what localities could do in that case is borrow money to try to cover the cost until they can find new sources of revenue or until the central government gives them more money. But the trouble there is localities are already doing that. They've already been borrowing a lot of money. Part of it is so that they can leverage real estate market deals. Because if you can make X amount of money investing some amount of your revenue into the real estate market to get a return, well, why not borrow money and make even more money? So they've actually already leveraged themselves up, which means that they don't have a lot of room on their balance sheet to take on more debt. An even bigger problem, though, is that if property markets significantly decline, then they might take the banking sector with them, in which case there's not going to be any banks available to lend to localities to cover shortfalls in revenue. In which case, not only do localities see shortfalls of revenue from the collapse in the property market, they're also not going to have any kind of buffer available in the form of bonds that they might issue to try to prevent the shortfall from being even worse. So basically, property market collapse could inculcate a financial market collapse, which could itself cause a knockoff collapse in local public services. And there would be no avenue available through which localities could mitigate that at all. They couldn't borrow money. There wouldn't be any way to raise money through real estate. And there's just no third option. There's like nothing else. So they would just get absolutely hammered. And the government, for its part, would be stuck with that debt. Like all of the debt the localities have been running up already, and then all of the debt that they might try to take on or could not take on but want to take on, the government itself would take on to try to bail them out. The government would have to take on all of that debt and the new debt obligations. And it's not clear if they have the room to do that, not only because they've already taken on so much debt and may not be able to find new people willing to lend to them, but it also may just be that the financial sector just can't lend to them any further. It may just be that the financial sector has already lent out so much money investing in property markets, which would again be rendered valueless by the collapse in property markets that we're talking about. But it would have also lended out already a lot of money to the localities so that they could do the same thing. So it may be that the financial sector has just been emptied of capital over the course of the past 10 years because of the real estate boom and because of corruption among localities, that they just don't have the money to lend to the national government to give them the resources they would need for all of the necessary bailouts in order to kind of resolve this issue in a more normal way, in a way that avoids the dramatic solutions I mentioned earlier. So localities, formal sector banks, and informal sector banks, all of them have exposure to this problem. It's not just the informal sector. And that's why there's much more risk than there would be normally if the whole thing were just more regulated and if there was less corruption. And so it's that aspect more than anything that's causing problems for Chinese regulators. They would like to mitigate the risk without dramatic solutions, but the whole problem is so thoroughly entangled in every aspect of China's local government, formal financial sector, and the shadow banking sector that there's no easy solution there to try to untangle all of that in an effective way. And again, I would point out, just to reiterate the point because it's so important, Chinese regulators have to do all of this untangling without having data. They don't know the extent of the entanglement between the formal and informal sector.
Yeah, because by its nature, it's off the record.
Yeah, exactly. So any substantive policy solution they try to implement could be inadvertently the trigger that causes the whole thing to implode. And they wouldn't know it until it happened. And again, to reiterate, that's why they've been so cautious. They're not going to take big dramatic actions, yet, unless things get really bad, because they don't want any one given action to be the one that is the straw on the camel's back and just accidentally causes the whole thing to explode.
Mm-hmm. Circling back to the thing I mentioned near the start, talking about U.S. and how people vote is the bottom line for the end civilian, and how the shadow banking system going away would mean for a ton of people, and basically anyone who uses that, they're not going to have as good of ROI. They will still have a banking option, but regulation usually means that you're compromising with some of your profits for better security, and not everyone's going to be happy about that.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I would point out here as an additional point to all of this, I hope it makes sense. I'm kind of rambling from point to point, but I'm hoping it's kind of represents a cohesive whole here. But I've already said that I think that the government could handle this in the worst case scenario because of a combination of nationalizations and or monetization of debt combined with restrictions on withdrawals. So if it came to that, I think it would be able to contain the crisis, albeit at the cost of long-term problems. But there's a scenario in which even the most dramatic of policy responses is not sufficient to resolve the crisis. And so that scenario involves a total collapse in confidence. So this has to do with individual investors, just like the little guy on the street who wants to invest his money like in a bank or in whatever. So the stability of any financial sector depends on people investing their money somehow, like putting your money in a bank, invested in real estate, whatever, something, so that that money is in the economy doing something. But what happens is that if people think that, let's use a bank in this example, if people think that a bank is insolvent and that it might not survive and that they might not get their money back when they need it, then they'll try to get their money out of the bank. They'll just pull it. They'll go to the bank and they'll say, hey, I want all my money. And then the bank will have to give it to them, and then they'll take it and they'll stuff it under their mattress or something so that it's safe. Mm-hmm. And if a lot of people lose confidence in a bank, then you get what's called a run on the bank, where everybody tries to pull their money out of the bank at once. Now, banks engage in what's called fractional banking, and what that means is that banks actually lend out more money than they have in deposits. So that means at any given time, banks never have enough money to give back all of the money that they take from people. And that's a problem, obviously. Because if everybody tries to get their money out at once, then the bank just runs out of money. And then the problem with insolvency and the bank shutting down becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So avoiding a run on the banks is a big policy objective of any regulator. You don't want to have a run on the banks. Now, if there's a broad-based financial crisis, then what can happen is if people lose confidence all over the financial sector, then there will be runs on all of the banks. Everybody will try to get their money out because they don't have sufficient confidence in any bank to protect their money and to survive the financial crisis that's happening. Now, what happens at that point is that you get this massive outflow of money from the economy. Because instead of having money being invested and then traded to build stuff and percolating through different parts of the economy, instead that gets completely shut off. And the money is just stuck in place, not being used. And that has significant knock-on effects for the broader economy and its dynamism. Effectively, doing so reduces the money supply in an economy rapidly. And that results in significant capital shocks to banks and to any industry that's disproportionately dependent on loans from banks. So the potential scenario that I'm describing here could happen in China. Like, it could be that China could nationalize the real estate industry and it could monetize all of its debts so nobody loses any money, and that everything that might result in a financial crisis is frozen in place, effectively. But it could be that doing so, or maybe even just the lead up to that, is enough to scare investors to the point where everybody just says, you know what, this economy is not sufficiently safe to invest money in anywhere. And so I'm going to pull all of my money from banks, and if I have any outstanding investments, then I'm going to sell them to get my money out so that I can have all of my money safely under my mattress. And in a population as large as China, that could be hundreds of millions of people. And in an economy as large as China, that could be tens of trillions of dollars, all being withdrawn at the same time. And there would not be a lot that the Chinese government could do about that. You can freeze accounts, you can freeze investments. There's a lot of things the government can do to basically stop economic activity. But overall, because so much of that is in the shadow sector, there's a limit to how effective it would be. And even if you could stop people from withdrawing their money, you couldn't stop them from refraining from putting more of their money into the economy. It could be that the savings rate in the aftermath of such dramatic action is 100%. And it's not 100% of savings that then gets invested, it just gets stuffed under a mattress and isn't used for anything. So, like, best case scenario for the government in that case is that they can just freeze in place investments that already exist, but they're not getting any more. But most likely they won't even be able to do that. More likely people will find ways, probably illegal, corrupt ways, to get their money out of the economy. So this crisis of confidence in the financial sector and the economy writ large could overwhelm even the most dramatic of policy action on the part of the government. And in that case, the government and the economy are just screwed. At that point, it's going to be a cascading collapse that just can't be stopped. And we don't know what that looks like, because we've never seen that happen on such a large scale or in a country that has an economy that is as globally integrated or is as important in that global economy as China's. That would be a totally unprecedented event. It would be very interesting to watch from the perspective of an economist. It would be calamitous for most anybody and everybody else. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but that is an outside tail event that could happen. And again, that's why China is so worried about this. More specifically, the Chinese government. That's exactly the kind of unpredictable outcome that they really don't want to happen and are trying to prevent. But I would point out here that a crisis of confidence is abstract, right? It's not something fixed in place. Like, if you don't want people to invest in something, or if you do want people to invest in something, there's little things the government can do to incentivize or disincentivize it. But confidence is such an abstract, peripheral thing, right? It's not something that's tangible. It very much depends on mood, on emotion. You know, it's what economists would call animal spirits. And the Chinese government doesn't have a specific ready-made toolkit that it can design or use in order to address that kind of problem. So, you know, if the Chinese government did use its big tools in its toolbox, like the big dramatic actions like nationalization or monetization, that could stop the tangible side of the crisis from manifesting. But the animal spirits could be negatively impacted. You know, those very steps that solve the crisis could cause a bigger crisis if they cause that crisis of confidence that I mentioned. And again, that's why the Chinese government is being cautious, because even their strongest tools could themselves be the catalyst for a broader economic collapse.
Interesting. Yeah, and since the whole economy is global and a bunch of our stuff is produced over there, that would impact us as well, basically everybody.
Yeah, China buys a lot of American stuff, so American exporters would be hit pretty badly. There are some investors in America who have been putting more money into China, so they would be impacted, although there's not very many of them yet. But also, China is an important part of the supply chain, so major disruptions there would percolate through the American supply chain and have knock-on effects here as well. Yeah, it would be a shock. If it happened, it would probably happen relatively quickly. Maybe the Chinese government could have some kind of managed decline where they slow it down. That would be useful for us, but it also may not be manageable from their perspective. It's kind of an unknowable variable right now. But in that scenario, if they did manage a slow decline, then maybe there would be enough time for American manufacturers to adjust their supply chains so that they were not too badly disrupted. Possibly. Speculation on my part. But yeah, it would definitely have a negative impact overall on everybody. You know, keep in mind, China's economy is one of the major drivers of the global economy. You know, the US economy is still the main one. You know, we still buy a lot of stuff. Like, an unreasonable amount of stuff is bought in the United States. But China's easily number two. And if anything happens to them, that's definitely having an impact. You know, people around the world will feel that, including in the United States.
Watch out for those shadow banks.
Yeah. But that's a sort of cursory look at the Chinese economic issue. that the Chinese government is facing right now, vis-a-vis Chinese banks and the real estate market and whatnot. I know that's a lot to take in, but that wasn't necessarily the most cohesive, presentable way to do it, but off the top of my head, that's like the best representation I can give on the spot.
I appreciate that.
Don't worry, the media will definitely be covering that story more, and probably very soon. People more articulate than I will present it to you in a more consumable fashion.
And
although
people
probably
less
not under the
articulate
best
than
of
you.
circumstances.
People less articulate than you will say a bunch of bullshit as well. So that's something
Oh,
to look forward
definitely.
to.
Oh yeah, that goes without saying. There's always that market. Oh, I got way off track. You were asking me about Taiwan and Pelosi?
Yeah, some people just wanted an update on that situation, if anything impactful happened.
Not really. I mean, the Chinese government, I mean, like I said before, it was mostly media hype. Like, obviously, the Chinese government was upset about it, and the US government apparently wanted to do it, although was sending mixed signals on that. Mostly it was Pelosi's own initiative. Like, from what I read, the Biden administration was not, like, eager for that. Although it could have been stage managed. I can't entirely rule that out. It may be that the US government wanted to send a signal to Taiwan that they wanted to show support, that they supported them rather, but they wanted to do so in a way that did not necessarily aggravate China too much. So have a House rep, Nancy Pelosi, go to Taiwan, but otherwise don't have like an executive branch official visit Taiwan. So maybe that was the compromise, but that's pretty charitable. I haven't really gotten the impression that the Biden administration is too terribly cohesive when it comes to dealing with big, complicated problems. I don't entirely blame them for that. Some of these problems have been around for decades now, and nobody else has had like great solutions either. But Biden administration a little bit discombobulated overall. But anyway, Pelosi went. She went there. The Chinese government huffed and puffed and pretended to be mad about it, which is what they have to do for political reasons. And then she left, and that was more or less the end of it. The Chinese government has nominally retaliated since then. They've had war games, which they were kind of already planning to do anyway. But they've supposedly passed over the Taiwanese border. They've shot some missiles, like just over the border into Taiwan's waters or something. And then they also announced that they were going to cease cooperation with the United States in a couple key areas. They were going to stop cooperating in terms of climate legislation and climate action. They were going to cut off military to military ties. They were going to cut off as well criminal cooperation, like cooperating over things like extradition and investigating criminal actions, like the fentanyl thing. I think specifically they said they were going to stop cooperating on drug charges and whatnot. And they also said that they were going to stop cooperating on immigration. So the United States sometimes catches illegal, undocumented immigrants from China. China had been cooperating on repatriating those individuals. Now they say they're not going to cooperate on repatriating those individuals. So there's a lot of non-cooperation happening, but not really much of substance. Like in terms of climate action, they weren't really doing all that much anyway. So that's not really a big change. And cutting off military to military ties is not great. That had been an avenue through which actors within both governments could communicate with each other in the case of some unanticipated accidental event happening. Having extra communications channels is useful because if an accident happens, people can talk to each other and make clear that it was an accident and prevent any potential escalatory spiral. So by removing those communication channels, the Chinese government is introducing relatively more risk of an escalatory spiral happening, say, in the China Strait, or the Taiwan Strait, or whatever it's called. But that risk is not necessarily all that great, and I suspect they've probably got alternative secret channels set up by now. So not necessarily too big a deal overall in that regard. And then the other stuff as far as like criminal cooperation, the drug issue with fentanyl, that stuff is pretty small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. And probably they'll just start cooperating again like 6 months to a year from now. Quietly. It'll just be done subtly.
What's the drug issue with fentanyl?
A lot of the fentanyl consumed in the United States is actually produced in China, specifically South China.
Oh.
Yeah. And so because China doesn't like fentanyl production either, it's not as though all of it produced in China just leaves for the United States. There's a lot of it that is consumed in China as well. So there's actually been a fair amount of cooperation between both governments as far as trying to shut that down. But now they say they're going to stop. But like I said, it's probably just going to be like 6 months to a year or something. But yeah, that's the only real substantive fallout thus far, and it's not really even that substantive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would reiterate what I said last time, which is that I'm not that worried about it. It's not that big a deal. It's mostly just posturing. Did we have other questions here? I don't think I saw any.
There was some fuss about the Gaza conflict.
Yeah.
I read some about that. I learned about a new thing. It's like roof tapping or something, where the Israeli Defense Force will basically tell people that, hey, we're about to strike this target, and they'll like call the civilians directly and let them know. Which is pretty surreal and weird, but it's helpful for them. Like, get the heck out if you want to live. It's a fair warning, because I think they're trying to hit terrorists and stuff, and that's a big part of the issue with this whole conflict. Is it's asymmetric in nature. You're not really looking at the Israeli army versus Palestinian army. You're having different explosions happen, and you're taking damage and needing to like dismantle these terrorist groups rather than fight a conventional war, which is really hairy whenever the terrorists are hiding out in civilian areas. So it's definitely a very a yikesy situation. I saw a clip of an ordnance hitting a location, and there were a bunch of people already there with their phones out, like ready to film it, because they knew, like, someone gets a call of, hey, your roof is about to get hit, get the fuck out, and they're like, oh shit, hey, get the camera. They're gonna hit this spot. But was there anything that you saw that was substantive or different than usual?
No, it's just the usual sparring, pretty much. I think it was instigated by a militia called Islamic Jihad.
Mm-hmm.
And they had, I think it was them firing a rocket or some damn thing. But regardless, Israel assassinated their leader. And so then they retaliated by launching more rockets. And then Israel retaliated by going after their membership. And so, yeah, par for the course. It's more action than usual, per se. But it's probably just going to last like a couple weeks. And then that'll be the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's always the possibility it escalates, but generally it doesn't, especially for smaller groups like Islamic Jihad.
Mm-hmm. So more or less business as usual.
Yep.
And then there was a question for you. What is the most interesting or uplifting bit of news you've observed in your knowledge searching over the last week?
Uplifting? Gosh. Yeah. I don't know. Uplifting is so subjective.
Yeah, but they're asking you.
Well, me, specifically. I don't know. I don't really focus on the uplifting stuff much, so it's a little hard to remember.
You could go with something funny then, or amusing.
Something funny.
Yeah.
There you go. I don't know that I could think of anything. I'd have to look through my notes or something, but I don't know what I could think of, like, just off the top of my head. There was some legislation that passed. Well, I guess it hasn't passed technically, but they made more progress on the CHIPS bill. It was like a semiconductor industrial policy bill, so that's probably going to get passed soon. So that happened, and in so much as the government doing things to help the economy and help with national security, which the bill is also designed to do, that could be considered to be good news.
people in government actually getting something done? What?
Yeah, occasionally it does still happen.
Accidents can happen.
Yeah. There you go. What else? Congo, Iraq. Did you see people in Iraq stormed their parliament?
No.
Yeah, they did it twice. Rated it. They were upset about the lack of a new government being formed. They had an election like 6 months ago, but the parties haven't been able to negotiate a majority coalition. Partly, the problem is that opposition parties are basically gumming up the works. They're little procedural tactics they've been using to delay things. And so that's resulted in Iraq not technically having a government for the past 6 months, and a lot of people didn't like that. So they had a big protest and ran into the parliament building and just kind of protested, sat on the furniture, what have you. Did protester type stuff. So then the police forced them out. They were still upset a couple of days later, so they did it again. Not too big a story, and I don't think it really achieved any of its major objectives, but it did make for some interesting pictures.
You said Iraq is where that was?
Yeah, Iraq. Yeah, they were in the capital, Baghdad. There was some new negotiations with Iran that happened. There apparently have not been formal negotiations regarding Iran's nuclear program for the past 6 months, but apparently they just started up again in Vienna. So the U.S. is negotiating more or less, the U.S. is negotiating directly with Iran over the nuclear problem. Although technically it's not directly. Technically, the Iranians are still refusing to negotiate in person with American negotiators. So European negotiators have to act as intermediaries. What they'll do is they'll have the U.S. delegation in one hotel room, and then they'll have the Iranian delegation in another hotel room, and the European negotiators will go between them with their respective offers and counter offers. The whole thing makes the process take way longer, but the Iranians have been very stubborn about it. And it could be that they're just delaying for time anyway, in which case, mission accomplished. That is indeed a very laborious, time-consuming way to negotiate. But the negotiations are at least formally, officially resumed at this point, for now. So that's noteworthy. Also, I read recently some interesting trivia. Apparently, Turkey has some nuclear power plants, or a nuclear power plant, anyway, that's being built by a Russian company. And apparently that company recently dumped all of their Turkish business partners. They had like suppliers and other businesses that they were dealing with, and they dumped all of the Turkish businesses they were dealing with and made a new deal to replace them and the services they were providing with a Russian company. And apparently that was the subject of some debate during a recent meeting between Erdogan and Putin during their little summit they had not too long ago. So I thought that was just interesting because, one, I didn't know that Turkey had nuclear power plants. Apparently they do, or at least they have one pending. And so that is a form of Russian leverage there. They could hypothetically cut them off from that, or at least from maintenance. Maybe they could find a different supplier who would be willing to continue construction and finish it, but I imagine that would be a little difficult since it's a different design. I don't know how difficult it is for different companies to work with nuclear reactors of different designs from other companies. I'm not sufficiently familiar with the industry to know that, but I imagine it would not necessarily be intuitive anyway. So that's a form of Russian leverage there. But then I also thought it was interesting how the Russian company itself that was building the reactor was able to pressure the Turkish government by trying to find different vendors to work with who were not Turkish but rather Russian. That's relevant because a big part of Turkey's political economy is the construction industry. A lot of the firms, I should just say, that back Erdogan in Turkey, who is the president of Turkey right now. A lot of the firms who back him and are a part of his patronage network are in the construction industry. So one of the ways that he maintains his patronage network is by starting up big construction projects, either funded by the government itself or partly backed by the government, or perhaps by doing deals with foreign governments in which they invest in the construction, well, in which they invest in the Turkish economy, which invariably involves at least some construction. So for a Russian company to purposely cut out Turkish construction companies is not accidental. Like, that's a political move by the Russian company, which presumably has ties to the Russian government, to pressure the Turkish political economy and leverage the contracts that they had to try to get some kind of concession. So some interesting geopolitics happening in the guise of contracts there. It was also noticeable, I should say, it was also notable in that Putin-Erdogan meeting that the Turkish side, Erdogan specifically, allegedly, according to a report in the Washington Post, refused to assist Russia in busting sanctions. In other words, they refused to help facilitate them in avoiding the sanctions regime that's been built up against them in Europe. Specifically, the Russian government proposed that Russian banks be allowed to set up accounts in Turkey through which they could do business with third-party companies outside of Turkey and Russia. So that would have been one way to help skirt some of the sanctions regime that has tried to cut off the Russian financial sector from doing business in the rest of the world. So the Turkish government apparently has refused to facilitate that. And so, as a result, the Russian economy is going to have to find alternative means, which it's kind of already done, but it would have been better for them if they could have done this deal with Turkey. So Turkey here facing both pressure from Russia and also exerting its own influence by rejecting the Russian proposal. And I read some interesting trivia about Sri Lanka as well. We talked before about the importance of tea production to the Sri Lankan economy, as well as tourism, as well as the impact the collapse in foreign currency had on agricultural production, and specifically the cutoff of foreign fertilizer on agricultural production. But there was another aspect of the economy that I actually hadn't been aware of until like a month ago that involved remittances. Apparently, a lot of people in Sri Lanka will leave Sri Lanka, work abroad, and then send money back to Sri Lanka. And those remittances that they send back are apparently an important source of foreign currency for the financial system there. So obviously, in 2020, with the pandemic, remittances collapsed because all of those people couldn't find work abroad, since there was all the lockdowns and whatnot. And so that also contributed to the collapse in foreign currency in Sri Lanka that led to the current economic crisis. We doing okay on time?
Yeah. Got another 19 minutes or so.
Gotcha.
There was a question about, in Cuba, they claim to have found the cure for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
Huh.
Which, for me, I would be big skeptical of that one.
Yeah.
That's like a super hard thing to solve with brain science that people around the world have been working on for decades at this point.
Yeah.
So if they did find it, fantastic. But share it, please, and prove that it works, because doubt. That's kind of part of some medical news that can tend to happen really often, which is, we found this new treatment that may be the cure to cancer. If I had $1 every time I saw a headline like that, I would be filthy rich. It's just a really common thing.
Yeah.
And then there's also a pretty big difference, too, between seeing remission in some condition for someone with a method versus that it generally works with everybody. There's a huge difference there, because sometimes people can just have some recovery based on their own physiology or the environmental factors or this or that. But it doesn't mean that you could just do that same treatment method on everybody and then you've just solved the problem overall.
Yeah, exactly.
It would be cool, though, if they did fix that.
Yeah, if they did, full credit. That would definitely be a major contribution. But I'm just, it's an authoritarian one-party state. It's not as though they don't have a history of overselling accomplishments. And their healthcare system has been kind of squeezed, not only because of the sanctions placed on them by the United States over the past couple decades, but the pandemic and the collapse in tourism that happened because of the pandemic also really had a big impact on Cuba's economy. So they've also had a bit of a foreign currency problem, similar to Sri Lanka for the past couple of years, and that's resulted in some considerable difficulties for industries that are reliant on imports, up to and including Cuba's healthcare sector. Yeah, Cuba has like a lot of doctors. They actually had a pretty relatively developed healthcare system before the communists took power, and they've been able to leverage that into a relatively well-performing healthcare system with corresponding good healthcare results, relatively good, a relatively healthy population to show for it. And they also sometimes send doctors abroad as a kind of diplomatic move. They have a lot of doctors, so they'll make a deal with the country to send doctors to provide free health care or free health consultations, and in exchange, that country will give them resources in return. For a long time, they had that deal with Venezuela, so Venezuela would give them oil in exchange for deploying, however many Cuban doctors to the country.
Oil for doctors trade, interesting.
Yeah, it worked for a while until Venezuela couldn't produce any oil anymore, so then it kind of became a problem. But yeah, they do have a relatively good healthcare system, all things considered. So they punch a little bit above their weight. The idea that they might cure a disease or something is not outside the realm of possibility. I think they actually did develop their own COVID vaccines. I don't know how effective they are. I don't know if anybody's tested them yet, but technically they did do that. But in general, some of the bigger, more grandiose pronunciations I would be appropriately skeptical of, just because the political culture and political economy there are not really conducive to honesty in such things. So I'm not saying they're incapable of it. I'm just saying I don't really think it's likely. But I'm open to being proven wrong. Certainly in this case, it would be good if I were wrong, right? That would definitely be a very useful treatment to have, given how many people suffer from those maladies. But yeah, as far as the question itself, I haven't heard that, so I can't really comment on it too much, other than expressing skepticism.
Yep, we'll see it whenever they can represent it a whole bunch of times, because if they just eliminate Parkinson's and Alzheimer's in their country, then the world's going to be like, hey, how'd you do that? And then you can kind of expand it out from there. It's a pretty closed country, though, so I feel like just sharing the science with people probably has a bunch of red tape, being embargoed and all.
Yeah, most likely. It wouldn't surprise me. Any other big topics you wanted to kind of get to?
I think that was most of the ones that I had jump out at me this week. Did you have anything? Any major Ukraine war gains or losses?
Oh, yeah, a little. Yeah, I didn't have much, so it'll be really short. Oh yeah, I just had a note about Starlink being very effective. So that's been very useful for the Ukrainian army, because it's apparently pretty hard to jam, supposedly. So the Russians don't really have a way to do that. And so that's allowed Ukrainian communications to be more robust, but also more secure. So that's always very useful. The only other thing I had here was that Turkish drones are apparently not as useful at this stage of the conflict than they were earlier. Yeah, apparently Russian air defenses have improved over time, and that makes it more difficult for the drones to operate. And also, the Russians are doing better at jamming them. Apparently, they don't have a particularly sophisticated communication system by which the operator controls the aircraft. So as a result, they're more vulnerable for that reason.
They could be hacked.
Yeah. So the Bayraktar still has a cool song, but is not as impactful on the battlefield, it seems.
Of various air weapons, it has a better song than other air weapons, but its effectiveness maybe not tip-top.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking too about the pacing of the conflict. Initially, they're like blitzing, so they're just like rolling tons of stuff in really fast and trying to just grab Kyiv if they can. So during that, I feel like the formations and the movements and the air support were just really sloppy and not really something they could rely on. So something like a Bayraktar that can deal out some damage but doesn't really have defensive capabilities of its own is gonna thrive. But whenever they're organized and ready to defend themselves and stuff, then it's kind of like a more of a paperweight that can fly through the air, paper plane.
Yeah. Yeah, I read about that in an article that was talking more broadly about drones and drone warfare. And their argument basically was that drones are an important new step, a new tool available for modern warfare, but they're probably not going to dominate the future of warfare. And the reason that they argue that is because air defenses have correspondingly improved over time, and that modern drones are actually pretty vulnerable to air defenses now. Such that if you have decent modern air defenses, you're probably pretty well protected from drones. And in a lot of the cases, and a lot of the conflicts over the past few years, drones have been impactful pretty much only when there's an absence of modern air defenses. So it's not the silver bullet that it is sometimes made out to be.
Yeah, it's a new form of tech, but it's not like spooky and unbeatable. There are counter units to the drones.
Exactly. So that'll be a great reassurance to those of you who argue in favor of tanks and the perpetuation thereof in modern warfare. There's been some debate about that in some circles, about whether tanks have any place on the modern battlefield, given that you can blow one up with a drone. Yeah, they still do have a place. That's the real answer to that. That argument really comes down to tanks still being the most survivable unit on the battlefield. Even if it is vulnerable, it's still more survivable than, say, infantry, which are just as vulnerable, if not more so, to drone warfare. But of course, it's a moot point if you can just shoot down all the drones anyway, so we'll probably still keep tanks, in other words.
Tank drivers, you may still have a job.
Yeah. Well, the only other big thing I kind of wanted to comment on tonight just regarded economic data, because that's kind of become more relevant politically lately. So speaking as an economist, the data right now that's been coming out for the past year or so is weird. It's very strange, contradictory data. Well, I shouldn't call the data contradictory, but it's sending contradictory signals. So it's not the case that the data says that we're about to have a recession or are maybe already in a recession, or that the economy is actually not in recession. Really, the takeaway is that the data is sending mixed signals and that it's hard to interpret right now. So a lot of economists are more in the position of taking a wait-and-see approach, where we try to see what the data is actually telling us by watching, which is pretty much what I've been saying economists would have to do with the modern economy, given that we don't really know how it works yet. So if anybody tells you that we're definitely in a recession or we're definitely not, they're probably bullshitting you. It's probably just more... the real takeaway is that it's confusing. There is definitely more inflation. There is definitely surveys suggesting greater expectations of inflation, which is itself a driver of inflation. Consumer confidence is down. Yield curves have inverted, which is generally a signal that a recession is coming. Inventories are expanding. That's also another leading indicator of recession. The government is spending less because there's less support. The unemployment insurance expansion that happened under COVID, that's ended. So there's less money going to that. And there's also just higher taxes in general and greater tax collection. So all of that, all of those are headwinds. Well, in the latter case, headwinds, in other cases, leading indicators of a downturn. But at the same time, there's countervailing data. Like it could be that inflation is just due to high energy prices. And we've seen some of the leading, we've seen some of the factors that have really led inflation in the energy sector come down recently. So like gasoline prices and oil in particular have been coming down the past month or so. So it could be that future inflation is actually lower once we get those reports on account of that. And consumers also largely base their sentiment off of gasoline prices because that's such a big part of their annual consumption or annual expenditures. So it could be that expectations of future inflation as well as consumer sentiment improve as gasoline prices go down, assuming they continue to go down anyway. And it could be that inventories are just expanding because of the bullwhip effect. You know, there's been some talk about that. You know, if you don't know what the bullwhip effect is, basically that's just a term describing companies dramatically increasing their orders as the economy recovered. Because obviously there was a lot of supply chain disruptions and people didn't have the supplies they needed or couldn't get them in a timely manner. So if you're a company and you think that's going to continue to be a problem, what's one solution to that? Well, one solution is to order way more stuff than you need so that you can have a large inventory available as a buffer against any future supply chain problems. The problem comes when all of the companies in the economy do that all at once, which creates a massive surge in demand. And that just exacerbates the supply chain problems because now they're trying to process even more stuff. So the bullwhip came later. Basically, all of these companies were buying way more stuff than they needed to build up inventories, but then the economy started to decline, and they also faced headwinds from inflation. So now, just when they've got the inventories they need, now the economy looks like it might be starting to decline. And so they're getting punished, basically, for trying to have a secure supply chain by building up inventories by a collapse in orders. And I think orders have technically gone down. I think that was in the data too. So that's the bullwhip effect. But that also explains why inventories have been going up. It's not just because inventories are building up because people are buying less, and there's been mixed data on that too. It's also because companies have just been building up inventories so that they can have a buffer against supply chain disruptions. So it's not necessarily the leading indicator for a recession that it might be, that it would be in a normal economy, which we very much do not have right now. Well, that's a different thing. But yeah, in general, there's also been mixed data on consumption. Like supposedly, there's been a fall in orders. Companies are less profitable because of inflation and because of issues with orders and whatnot. But at the same time, overall consumption is still going up. It's increasing at a decreasing rate. It's not increasing as fast as it was, but it's still not negative. Like, even in spite of all of these problems and in spite of all of the inflation, overall consumption is still going up, which suggests that the economy is still relatively healthy. It's also worth mentioning that unemployment is down. You know, that was one of the big recent pieces of economic data that came out. Unemployment is at a record low. In fact, we actually have recovered, I think, all of the jobs that we lost as a result of the pandemic now, like officially. So high consumption that is still positive and growing, and very low unemployment. And apparently that unemployment is still falling. So how do you square that with all of the other negative indicators of the economy? Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So a lot of this is pretty contradictory, and economists don't really know what to make of it. We have some ideas. I already suggested some of them. But we're not really going to know for sure until we just observe how things pan out and see how the economy performs under all of these pressures. And then that'll allow us to, in hindsight, explain all of this stuff. But of course, explaining stuff in hindsight is not very satisfactory if you're a business or a consumer or whatnot. You want to know what's going to happen before it happens so that you can prepare. So not very satisfying from their perspective, but very interesting from an academic economist's perspective. Everybody is very enthralled with all of the goings on. from that sort of side of the economy.
One macro thing that's interesting to think about is the generation of material goods and value versus the growth in population. And then you have the distribution of that across the population of we're making more cool shit over time that operates differently within the economy. But the population is still rising globally, and it will do so for a while.
Mm.
Is that going to make us feel more wealthy or feel less wealthy? Or it could be both at the same time, because we have that income disparity between the uber elite and the lower class and stuff.
It'll be region specific.
Yeah.
Because there are whole regions that are much wealthier and have higher income. So even if you're like just a middle class schlub in, Germany or the United States, you don't necessarily feel the rising population and the corresponding fall in per capita income. Like if you live in a country with low population growth and high output, you'll still do pretty well, most likely. You may not feel it. Whereas if you live in India, where there's pretty moderate to pedestrian economic growth at the same time as high population growth, yeah, you'll definitely experience it there. That's actually one of the big policy problems facing the Indian government right now.
It's India and Africa that are still growing the most.
Yeah, those are the main ones.
China, Japan, and most of the Western countries are below replacement.
Yeah. Yeah, the United States still has a rapidly growing population, but that's mostly immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. US population growth is crazy. I think I've talked about it before, but like, what was it? It was in Europe. No, during World War II, the US population was about 14% of Europe's population, something like that. So we basically had the population of a large European country. Smaller than Russia's, but bigger than Germany's, kind of in between. But since then, the US population has grown so much, and Europe's population has grown relatively little. The US population is now closer to 40 to 45% of Europe's population. So we're approaching a population that's on par with a continent rather than just another country in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's wild. That is like insane high growth there. And again, that stems mostly from just immigration. So that's pretty useful if you can generate enough new jobs and high productivity in those jobs to leverage that higher growth into greater production and more stuff so as to maintain quality of life. Whether or not we can continue to do that is a big question, and the answer to that will be the major determinant of just how high the standard of living will be in the United States going forward. But if you live in a place like India, most likely the answer is no. Like the productivity in the Indian economy is not great. I've got your Twitch thing open here, and I kind of just casually noticed somebody asking if population growth in India had actually fallen over time. The answer is yes. They actually have invested a lot in family planning, and population growth is much lower than it used to be. It's not nearly as rapid. But the trouble is that economic growth is not really keeping pace. Like they're just not generating enough to generate enough jobs for all of those people to ensure that there's a growth in the overall quality of living.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, referring back to that book I mentioned, one of the ways that the Indian government tried to control population growth, which really was very high way back in the aftermath of independence, one of the ways they tried to control that so that economic growth could catch up to it was via sterilization. And it was all voluntary in the 50s and 60s, right? They would pay people to do it, mostly men, and they would encourage people to do it on their own. And, it was just a part of the overall family planning, population control policy implemented by the government. But there was a period of authoritarian rule in India, spearheaded by Indira Gandhi, whom is, one of the heroes or the villains of Indian politics, depending on who you talk to. And she actually imposed a involuntary sterilization program, specifically in rural areas in which any man who was in a family that had 2 children or more had to be sterilized. And as you can imagine, that was very unpopular.
Yeah.
That was extremely unpopular and resulted in the basically collapse of the Indian National Congress, specifically their seats at the national and state level. It didn't last for all that long. They ended up back in power in a couple of years, but they were definitely punished for that once emergency rule was lifted anyway.
Interesting. Yeah, I could definitely see that pissing people off. We try to get people to take a vaccine and they fire up a storm, let alone being made sterile involuntarily. Yikers, Batman.
Yeah, it was a kind of a dark period in India's history right there.
Mm-hmm.
But people still remember Indira fondly because she was kind of a left-wing populist figure in politics, so some people still liked her. Also, she had some tragedy. Her son died early, very young. Sanjay Gandhi was his name. He died in a car wreck. And also, she was seen as being persecuted by the opposition. They tried to launch a bunch of cases against her for corruption and tried to get her thrown in prison. And so some people were sympathetic to her after that. And her memory is also somewhat colored by the fact that she was assassinated. And so that always kind of, you know, people don't like to speak ill of the dead and they like to focus on the positive things she did. So that also ended up kind of disproportionately coloring the institutional cultural memory of her time in power. But yeah, I don't know that all of that sympathy is really deserved. I mean, involuntary sterilization aside, her son was also kind of a psycho. He did some of that. He was partly responsible for directing the sterilization program. And he actually did some of it himself, apparently, like specifically going around and directing it at the local level, from what I've read. So, yeah, people were really genuinely afraid that if he became prime minister after her mother, retired from politics, that he would be even more authoritarian. So, in a way, India may have dodged a bullet since he was killed in that car crash. And his brother was a lot more chill. Like Sanjay Gandhi, the son I'm talking about, was specifically groomed to succeed Indira Gandhi as leader of the Congress Party. He had a brother named Rajiv Gandhi who didn't want anything to do with it. He was just like an airline pilot in Europe. His wife was like an Italian lady. He was just sort of living it up in Europe, doing his own thing. But when Sanjay died, Indira Gandhi went to him and basically just told him, all but begged him basically to get involved in politics so that he could be the new successor. And he ended up answering the call, but it was never really like his first choice, and you could kind of tell that he would have rather been doing other things, basically. He actually did a pretty good job. He was kind of more of a liberalizer and reformer, not so much of the authoritarianism that you saw with Indira and Sanjay.
It's a really interesting aspect of people's drive to be in politics versus how responsible they are with the power. It's almost like people who don't want to be there, but they're put into politics, do a more honest job because they're just trying to do what's meant to be done in the role rather than how can I accelerate my career and make my name as big as possible and that kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, you could probably consider him an example of that. But he was also unable really to kind of deal with the biggest problems in India. And certainly he was not able to deal with like the structural flaws in Indian politics at that time, which involved like all of the corruption, of which there was a great deal. We kind of touched on that earlier. So he ended up getting his party anyway, ended up getting embroiled in a big corruption scandal. And the party ended up losing power as a result of that. His minister of finance, actually, from what I was reading, was investigating, a whole litany of corruption cases. And he was a little too fervent. He was he ended up targeting some high-level people. And so they actually moved him to be the head of the Ministry of Defense instead of the Ministry of Finance. But the trouble there is that he found more corruption. He started investigating that. So then they just kicked him out entirely. He just no longer had a cabinet position. And so then he left the party and joined the opposition. And he ended up becoming the new prime minister when the opposition was able to win power. That didn't last too long either because of another corruption scandal. It's a common theme in Indian politics. And Congress ended up winning power again, but during the campaign for that election in which Congress came back, Rajiv Gandhi ended up getting assassinated. He was killed by the Tamil Tigers because in the mid 80s, earlier, when he was still prime minister, there was a lot of demand in India, especially the south in Tamil Nadu, well, maybe not intervene in the conflict, but to try to mediate the conflict and try to bring it to a close. Because the northern part of Sri Lanka has a lot of ethnic Tamils. And so the Tamil population in India was sympathetic and wanted the Indian government to help. So as part of the peace deal that was signed and mediated by India, Indian peacekeeper troops were deployed to Sri Lanka. And part of their objective there was to disarm the Tamil Tigers. And the Tamil Tigers did not want to be disarmed, partly because the Sri Lankan government wasn't really honoring their part of the deal. But the Indian peacekeepers went ahead with the disarmament program. The Tamil Tigers ended up fighting back, in effect, going to war with the Indian peacekeepers. And as a result, Rajiv Gandhi ended up being targeted by an assassin. Specifically, it was a young woman who blew him up in a suicide bombing. She strapped bombs to her body and killed him. It's also worth noting that he didn't really have bodyguards at that time. He kind of had a relatively light security so that he could move around and interact with people more. That's a big part of Indian campaigning. So he was a pretty vulnerable target. And a suicide bomber was, a pretty good choice. He was definitely thoroughly dead afterwards. It's worth noting, too, kind of as a side note here, that it was actually the Tamil Tigers that pioneered suicide bombing of that variety. It wasn't actually Islamists or Palestinian nationalists. It was actually the Tamil Tigers that kind of started that. You could probably find examples before then, but it didn't really get to be a widespread thing until the Tamil Tigers did it. It was only later that you really saw it become common in places like Palestine, where it's more associated with now. That is more associated with suicide bombings these days. But yeah, he was assassinated, and so Congress had to move on. At first, this is kind of getting into tangents now, but at first the Congress Party actually wanted to replace him with his wife, because there weren't really any other people in the Gandhi clan who could kind of pick up the slack. He actually did have children, but they were way too young to kind of take control of the party. But his wife didn't want to do it, at least not at that point. So they actually had to go with another guy, a guy named Rao, who ended up being the first Indian of Southern descent to become Prime Minister of India. And that worked for a couple years until the party got unpopular, and then they ended up getting voted out. But what happened in around 1996 is that Rajiv Gandhi's wife changed her mind, and she actually did decide to become leader of the party, which the party was willing to facilitate. And she's been leader ever since. She never stopped. And the thing is, as you might recall from what I said earlier, she's not Indian. She's actually an Italian lady. She's the Italian woman that Rajiv married when he was still in Europe as a pilot. So the head of one of the most powerful parties in India, for much of the past couple of decades anyway, was actually controlled by an Italian woman, an Italian national. Obviously, she's become a citizen of India since then. But it's just some interesting trivia. I think her name is Sonia Gandhi. And she very much presents herself as Indian, and, she kind of looks the part. And it's not too big a deal in the grand scheme of things. There were some people in the party that didn't like it and defected and started their own parties, but overall, it ended up being a pretty manageable transition. Now, I think in the past 5 years, Congress has become even more irrelevant. A lot of people have been switching sides or forming their own parties or just voting for the BJP, which is the current party in power right now. But since then, Congress has started to shift more to the children of Rajiv Gandhi. He had two, one son and a daughter. And I think the daughter's name is Priyanka Gandhi, and she's considered to be the more politically astute one. The son doesn't really seem to care that much. He was basically foisted into the role. He's still not leader of the party, but you can tell that Indira Gandhi is kind of grooming him for it. But his heart doesn't really seem to be in it, and he's not very effective. I don't know that putting Priyanka Gandhi in charge would change the outcome much. Congress really seems to be in terminal decline at this point. But they are technically trying to pass the torch to the next generation of Gandhis there. Just as a side note, no relation here to Mahatma Gandhi, the famous leader during the Indian independence movement. This is actually a different clan. Actually, Indira Gandhi was the daughter of Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, the guy who was prime minister upon independence and was leader of India for like 15 years or so. Well, 20 years more like, after India became independent. She married a guy whose last name was Gandhi, so she changed her name. It was politically, it was a nice move because a lot of people think of Gandhi as Mahatma Gandhi, but there's actually no relation at all. So it was actually Nehru's daughter who succeeded him, and it was Nehru's daughter's grandson's wife who currently controls the party, and it's their grandchildren basically who are now looking to take control of the party. Well, Indira Gandhi's grandchildren who are now looking to take control of the party.
Chad is saying that Nehru was Gandhi's pupil.
Oh yeah, I'm saying there was no familial relation.
Yeah.
There was no blood relation between them.
Despite
But yeah, they were
the
all
name would
part of the
suggest.
same movement.
There's a bit of a funny question we can kind of wrap up with here from Fuzzy Cord. Speaking of suitability of candidates, what's Agent Smith's opinion on sortition, which is electing people by random lottery?
It's a bad idea. Don't do that.
Why?
You never know who you're going to get, right? You might get somebody who's really, really capable and really awesome. You might get somebody who's really mediocre, but who at least is in touch with the people, like the common people, and is able to bring their experience into the policymaking process.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be you just get a total dipshit, and they just ruin everything for their own purposes, because they hate everybody, or they're self-aggrandizing, or they're greedy, or, whatever reason. Like, it could be that whatever problem you're trying to solve by doing that is instead entirely encapsulated in the person that you end up choosing as a part of that process.
Yeah.
In which case they actually end up exacerbating the problem rather than making it better.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's a very wise course of action.
It would be entertaining.
Oh, for sure. The downfall of civilization always is.
Wow. I like it when Agent Smith uses words like dipshit. He's professional 99% of the time, and it's cool when those slip through. Thanks, Agent Smith, for keeping it real.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity.
Well, nice. Thanks, Chad, for hanging out. We had a good discussion today covering... today felt like we hit a few different areas pretty evenly, but a pretty big emphasis on the Chinese economy and what's going on over there. And then we visited India for a good bit as well.
Yeah, always favorite topics for me. I always enjoy talking about them. So, again, I appreciate the opportunity and the patience.
And I got a good, funny visual of you helping people house hunt in China.
Yeah, that was an experience. They also made us put on these shoe covers, like plastic shoe covers, so we didn't have to take our shoes off when we were inside. Because you're supposed to. You're supposed to take your shoes off when you walk inside somebody's house in China. That's a cultural norm. But they just gave us some covers to put on so that we wouldn't have to do that. But mine were too small, so I ended up just ripping them, and they were just in tatters the whole time I was there.
The covers were too small for the shoes?
For my shoes. I have these big, fat American shoes, so of course they don't quite fit.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So I'm sure it was hilarious to the people who lived in the apartment who had to watch me. I'm sure they got a kick out of it, too.
This poor tourist. Well, cool. Thanks for sharing your expertise and some funny stories. Thank you, Neuro, for handling questions today. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yes, sir. See you next time. Thanks again.
20-minute walk. Got him.